and spreading our blankets on the bottom of the sphere, in such a manner as to shut out most of the moonlight, wished each other good night, and almost immediately chumvaugik ang gielsao, mcck kang jian zung quan, and so sleeping, and sometimes talking and reading a little, and at times eating, although without any keenness of appetite, but for the most part, in a sort of quiescence that was neither waking nor slumber. We fell through a space of time that had neither night nor day in it silently, softly, out nan vananang via mt trang na mt shik la ri. Footnote: it is a curious thing that while we were in the sphere, we kang h ko bktks themen now dg lao kang dung baa, nor did we feel the warmth of it. When we abstained at first we cc jiang and d kang muan, but afterwards we hon ton kang yong han thikan. Tingama noi we did not consume 1/100th part of the compressed provisions being brought with us. The amount of leung ki carbon dioxide trong kang ki we breathed was also unnaturally low, but why this was, I am quite kang the ls gigi ggc hyen tung nay. Chapter 6, The Landing on the Moon. I tong lay cash ma one day. Cavill suddenly opened 6 of our shutters and blinded me so that I cried aloud at him. The whole area was moon, a stupendous scimitar of white dawn, with its edge hacked out by notches of darkness. The crescent shore of an ebbing tide of darkness, out of which peaks and pinnacles came, glittering into the blaze of the sun. I take it the reader has seen pictures or photographs of the moon, and that I need not describe. The broader features of that landscape, those spacious ring-like ranges, vaster than any terrestrial mountains. The summits shining in the day, the shadows harsh and deep, the gray disordered plains, the ridges, hills, and cradle, it all passing at last from blazing illumination into a common mystery of black. I thought this world we were flying, scarcely 100 miles above its crests and pinnacles, and now we could see what no eye on earth will ever see, that under the blaze of the day, the harsh outlines of the rocks and ravines, of the plains and crater floor, grew gray and indistinct under a thickening haze, that the white of their licked surfaces broke into lumps and patches, and broke again and shrank and vanished, and that here, in their strange tints of brown and olive, grew and spread. But little time we had for watching then, for now we had come to the real danger of our journey. We had to drop ever closer to the moon as we spun about it, to slacken our pace and watch our chance until at last we could dare to drop upon its surface. For Cavill, that was a time of intense exertion. For me it was an anxious inactivity. I seemed perpetually to be getting out of his way. He leapt about the sphere from point to point with an agility that would have been impossible on Earth. He was perpetually opening and closing the cover right windows, making calculations, consulting his chronometer by means of the glow lamp. During those last eventful hours, for a long time we had all our windows closed and hung silently in darkness, hurling through space. Then he was feeling for the shutter studs, and suddenly four windows were open. I staggered and covered my eyes, drenched and scorched and blinded by the unaccustomed splendor of the sun beneath my feet. Then again the shutter snapped, leaving my brain spinning in a darkness that pressed against the eyes, and after that I floated in another vast black silence. Then Cavill switched on the electric light and told me he proposed to bind all our luggage together, with the blankets about it, against the concussion of our descent. We did this with our windows closed because in that way our goods arranged themselves naturally at the center of the sphere. That too was a strange business. We two men floating loose in that spherical space, and packing and pulling ropes. Imagine it if you can no up nor down, and every effort resulting in unexpected movements. Now I would be pressed against the glass with the full force of Cavill's thrust, Now I'd be kicking helplessly in a void. Now the star of the electric light would be overhead. Now underfoot. Now Caval's feet would float up before my eyes. And now we would be crossways to each other, but at last, our goods were safely bound together in a big soft bale, all except to blankets, with head holes that we were to wrap about ourselves. Then for a flash cover opened a window moonward, and we saw that we were dropping towards a huge, central crater with a number of minor craters, grouped in a sort of cross about it, and then again. Caval flung our little sphere open to the scorching, blinding sun. I think he was using the sun's attraction as a brake. "Cover yourself with a blanket," he cried, thrusting himself from me. And for a moment I did not understand. Then I hold the blanket from beneath my feet and got it about me and over my head and eyes. Abruptly he closed the shutters again, snapped one open again and closed it. Then suddenly began snapping them all open, each safely into its steel roller became ajar. And then we were rolling over and over, pumping against the glass, and against the big bale of our luggage, and clutching at each other. And outside some white substance splashed, as if we were rolling down a slope of snow. Over clutch bump, over came a thud, and I was half buried under the bale of our possessions, and for a space everything was still. Then I could hear Caval puffing and grunting, and the snapping of a shutter in its sash. I made an effort, thrust back our blanket-wrapped luggage, and emerged from beneath it. Our open windows were just visible as a deeper black, set with stars. We were still alive, and we were lying in the darkness of the shadow of the wall, of the great crater into which we had fallen. We sat getting our breath again, and feeling the bruises on our limbs. I don't think either of us had a very clear expectation of such rough handling as we received. I struggled painfully to my feet, and now should I to look at the landscape of the moon. But it's tremendously dark. Caval, the glass was dewy, and as I spoke, I wiped at it with my blanket. Well, half an hour or so beyond the day, he said we must wait. It was impossible to distinguish anything. We might have been in a sphere of steel, for all that we could see. My rubbing with the blanket simply smeared the glass, and as fast as I wiped, it became opaque again with freshly condensed moisture, mixed with an increasing quantity of blanket hairs. Of course, I ought not to have used the blanket. In my efforts to clear the glass, I slipped upon the damp surface and hurt my shin against one of the oxygen cylinders that protruded from my bale. The thing was exasperating. It was absurd. Here we were, just arrived upon the moon, amidst we knew not what wonders, and all we could see was the gray and streaming wall of the bubbling, which we had come. I found it, I said, but at this rate, we might have stopped at home, and I squatted on the bale and shivered, and drew my blanket closer about me. Abruptly, the moisture turned to spangles and fronds of frost. "Can you reach the electric heater?" said Cover. "Yes, that black knob, or we shall freeze." I did not wait to be told twice. "And now," said I, "what are we to do?" "Wait," he said. "Wait. Of course. We shall have to wait until our air gets warm again. And then this glass will clear. We can't do anything until then. It's night here. We must wait for the day to overtake us. Meanwhile, don't you feel hungry?" For a space I did not answer him, but sat threatening. I turned reluctantly from the smeared puzzle of the glass and stared at his face. "Yes," I said, "I am hungry. I feel somehow enormously disappointed. I had expected, I don't know what I had expected, but not this." I summoned my philosophy, and rearranging my blanket about me, sat down on the bale again, and began my first meal on the moon. I don't think I finished it. I forget. Presently, first in patches, then running rapidly together into wider spaces, came the clearing of the glass, came the drawing of the misty veil that hid the moon world from our eyes. We peered out upon the landscape of the moon. Chapter 7. Sunrise on the moon. as we saw at first. It was the wildest and most desolate of scenes. We were in an enormous amphitheater, a vast circular plain, the floor of the giant crater. Its cliff-like walls closed as in on every side. From the westward, the light of the unseen sun fell upon them, reaching to the very foot of the cliff, and showed a disordered escarpment of drab and grayish rock, lined here and there with banks and crevices of snow. This was perhaps a dozen miles away, but at first, no intervening atmosphere diminished in the slightest the minutely detailed brilliancy with which these things glared at us. They stood out clear and dazzling against the background of starry blackness that seemed to our earthly eyes rather a glorious, spangled velvet curtain than the spaciousness of the sky. The eastward cliff was, at first, merely a starless salvage to the starry dome. No rosy flush, no creeping pallor announced the commencing day. Only the corona, the zodiac light, a huge cone-shaped, luminous haze, pointing up towards the splendor of the morning star, warned us of the imminent nearness of the sun. Whatever light was about us was reflected by the westward cliffs. It showed a huge undulating plain, cold and gray, a gray that deepened eastward into the absolute raven darkness of the cliff shadow. Innumerable rounded gray summits, ghostly hummocks, pillows of snowy substance, stretching crest beyond crest into the remote of security, gave us our first inkling of the distance of the crater wall. These hummocks looked like snow. At the time I thought they were snow, but they were not. They were mounds and masses of frozen air. So it was at first, and then sudden. Swift and amazing came the lunar day. The sunlight had crept down the cliff. It touched the drifted masses at its base, and then constantly came, striding with 7 lead boots towards us. The distant cliffs seemed to shift and quiver, and at the touch of the door, in a reek of gray, vapor poured upward from the crater floor. Whirls and puffs and drifting wraiths of gray, thicker and broader and denser, until at last the whole westward plain was steaming, like a wet handkerchief held before the fire, and the westward cliffs were no more than refracted. Glare beyond. Is air, said Cover. It must be air, or it would not rise like this. At the mere touch of a sunbeam, at this pace he appeared upwards. Look, he said, what I asked in the sky, already on the blackness. A little touch of blue, oh, see, stars seem larger, and the little ones, and all those dim nebulosities we saw in empty space. They are hidden, swiftly, steadily. The day approached us. Gray summit after gray summit was overtaken by the blaze and turned to a smoking white intensity. At last there was nothing to the west of us but a bank of surging fog, the tumultuous advance and ascent of cloudy haze. The distant cliff had receded farther, and farther had loomed and chained through the world, and founded and vanished at last in its confusion. Nearer came that steaming advance, nearer and nearer, coming as fast as the shadow of a cloud before the southwest wind. About us rose a thin, anticipatory haze. Cavall gripped my arm. What I said, look, oh, the sunrise. The sun. He turned me about and pointed to the brow of the eastward cliff, looming above the haze about us, scarce lighter than the darkness of the sky. But now its line was marked by strange reddish shapes, tongues of vermilion flame that writhed and danced. I fancied it must be spirals of vapor that had caught the light and made this crest of fiery tongues against the sky, but indeed it was the soul of prominences. I saw a crown of fire above the sun that is forever hidden from earthly eyes by our atmospheric veil. Then, oh, the sun. Steadily, inevitably came a brilliant line, came a thin edge of intolerable effulgence that took a circular shape, became a bow, became a blazing scepter, and held a shaft of heat at us as though it was a spear. It seemed verily to stab my eyes. I cried aloud and turned about blinded, groping for my blanket beneath the bale, and with that incandescence came a sound, the first sound that had reached us from without since. We left the earth a hissing and rustling, the stormy, trailing of the aerial garment of the advancing day. And with the coming of the sound and the light, the sphere lurched and blinded and dazzled. We staggered helplessly against each other. It lurched again and the hissing grew louder. I had shut my eyes before. I was making clumsy efforts to cover my head with my blanket, and this second lurch sent me helplessly off my feet. I fell against the bale and, opening my eyes, had a momentary glimpse of the air. Just outside our glass it was running. It was boiling like snow, into which a white-hot rod is thrust. What had been solid air had suddenly, at the touch of the sun, become a paste, a mud, a slushy liquefaction that hissed and bubbled into gas. They came a still more violent world of the sphere, and we had clutched one another. In another moment we were spun about again. Round we went and over, and then I was on all fours. The lunar dawn had hold of us. It meant to show us little men what the moon could do with us. I caught a second glimpse of things without. Puffs of vapor, half liquid slush, excavated sliding. Falling, sliding, we dropped into darkness. I went down with Cavill's knees in my chest. Then he seemed to fly away from me. And for a moment I lay with all the breath out of my body, staring upward. A toppling crag of the melting stuff had splashed over us, buried us, and now it's thinned and boiled off us. I saw the bubbles dancing off the glass above. I heard cattle exclaiming feebly, then some huge landslip in the thawing air. Headquarters and splattering expostulation. We began to roll down a slope, rolling faster and faster, leaping crevices and rebounding from banks. Faster and faster westward into the white-hot, boiling tumult of the lunar day. Clutching at one another we spun about, pitched this way and that. Our bale of packages leaping at us, pounding at us, we collided. We gripped, we were torn asunder, our heads met, and the whole universe burst into fiery darts and stars on the earth. We should have smashed one another a dozen times. But on the moon, luckily for us, our weight was only 1/6 of what it is terrestrially, and we fell very mercifully. I recall a sensation of utter sickness, a feeling as if my brain were upside down within my skull, and then something was at work upon my face. Some thin feelers worried my ears. Then I discovered the brilliance of the landscape around was mitigated by blue spectacles. Cavill bent over me, and I saw his face upside down. His eyes also protected by tinted goggles. His breath came irregularly, and his lip was bleeding from a bruise. "Better," he said, wiping the blood with the back of his hand. Everything seemed swaying for a space, but that was simply my giddiness. I perceived that he had closed some of the shutters in the outer sphere to save me from the direct blaze of the sun. I was aware that everything about us was very brilliant. "Lord," I gasped. But this I craned my neck to see. I perceived there was a blinding glare outside. Another change from the gloomy darkness. "About first impressions, have I been insensible long?" I asked. "I don't know, the chronometer is broken." "Some little time, my dear chap. I have been afraid." I lay for a space taking this in. I saw his face still bore evidence of emotion. For a while I said nothing. I passed an inquisitive hand over my contusions and surveyed his face for similar damages. The back of my right hand had suffered most and was skinless and raw. My forehead was bruised and had bled. He handed me a little measure with some of the restorative, and I forget the name of it, he had brought with us. After a time I felt a little better. I began to stretch my limbs carefully. Soon I could talk. "It wouldn't have done," I said, as though there had been no interval. "No, it wouldn't." He thought, his hands hanging over his knees. He peered through the glass and then stared at me. "Good Lord," he said. "No. What has happened?" I asked. After a pause, "Have we jumped to the tropics?" It was as I expected. The air has evaporated, if it is air. At any rate, it has evaporated. and the surface of the moon is showing. We are lying on a bank of earthy rock. Here and there best soil is exposed, a queer sort of soil. It occurred to him that it was unnecessary to explain. He assisted me into a sitting position, and I could see with my own eyes. Chapter 8, The Lunar Morning, the harsh emphasis. The pitiless black and white of scenery had seen the Ma Noi disappeared. The glare of the sun had taken upon itself a faint tinge of amber. The shadows upon the cliff of the crater wall were deeply purple to the eastward, a dark bank of fog, still crouched and sheltered from the sunrise. But to the westward the sky was blue and clear. I began to realize the length of my insensibility. We were no longer in a void. An atmosphere had arisen about us. The outline of things had gained in character, had grown acute and varied. Save for a shadowed space of white substance, here and there. White substance that was no longer air but snow. The Arctic appearance had gone ting the Ma Noi. Everywhere broad, rusty brown spaces of bare and tumbled earth, spread to the blaze of the sun, here and there at the edge of the snow dress, with transient little pools and edges of water, the only things stirring in that expanse of barrenness. The sunlight inundated the upper to blinds of our sphere and turned our climate to high summer, but our feet were still in shadow, and the sphere was lying upon a drift of snow. And scattered here and there upon the slope, and emphasized by little, white threads of unthawed snow. Upon their shady sides were shapes like sticks, dried twisted sticks, of the same rusty hue as the rock upon which they lay. That court once thought sharply. Sticks on a lifeless world. Then as my eye grew more accustomed to the texture of this substance, I perceived that almost all this surface had a fibrous texture like the carpet of brown needles one finds beneath the shade of pine trees. Cover, I said, yes, it may be a dead world now, but once something arrested my attention. I had discovered among these needles a number of little, round objects, and it seemed to me that one of these had moved. Cavil, I whispered. What? But I did not answer it. Once I stared incredulous for an instant. I could not believe my eyes. I gave an inarticulate cry. I gripped his arm, I pointed. Look, I cried, finding my tongue. There, yes, I'm there. His eyes followed my pointing finger. He said. How can I describe the thing I saw? It is so petty a thing to state, and yet it seems so wonderful, so pregnant with emotion. I have said that amidst the stick-like litter were these rounded bodies, these little oval bodies, that might have passed as very small pebbles. And now first one and then another had stirred, had rolled over and cracked, and down the crack of each of them showed a minute line of yellowish green, thrusting outwards to meet the hot encouragement of the newly risen sun. For a moment that was all, and then they stirred and burst a third. It is a seed, said Cavall, and then I heard him whisper very softly, life, life, and immediately it poured upon us. That our vast journey had not been made in vain, that we had come to no arid waste of minerals, but to a world that lived and moved. We watched intensely, I remember. I kept rubbing the glass before me with my sleeve. Jealous of the fainter suspicion of mist, the picture was clear and vivid. Only in the middle of the field, all about that center the dead, fibers and seeds were magnified and distorted by the curvature of the glass. But we could see enough, one after another all down the sunlit slope. These miraculous, little brown bodies burst and gaped apart. Like seed pods, like the husks of fruits, opened eager mouths that drank in the heat and light, pouring in a cascade from the newly risen sun. Every moment more of these seed coats ruptured, and even as they did so, the swelling pioneers overflowed their rent, distended seed cases, and passed into the second stage of growth, with a steady assurance, a swift deliberation. These amazing seeds thrust a rootlet downward to the earth, and a queer little bundle-like bud into the air in a little while. The whole slope was dotted with minute plantlets. Standing at attention in the blaze of the sun, they did not stand for long. The bundle-like buds swelled and strained and opened with a jerk, thrusting out a coronet of little sharp tips, spreading a hole of tiny, spiky brownish leaves that lengthened rapidly, lengthened visibly even as we watched. The movement was slower than any animal's, swifter than any plants I have ever seen before. How can I suggest it to you? The way that growth went on. The leaf tips grew so that they moved onward. Even while we looked at them, the brown seed case shriveled and was absorbed with an equal rapidity. Have you ever on a cold day taken a thermometer into your warm hand and watched the little thread of mercury creep up the tube? These moon plants grew like that in a few minutes, as it seemed. The buds of the more forward of these plants had lengthened into a stem and were even putting forth a second haul of leaves, and all the slope that it seemed so recently a lifeless stretch of litter was now dark with the stunted, olive-green herbage of bristling spikes that swayed with the vigor of their growing returned. About and behold, along the upper edge of a rock to the eastward, a similar fringe in a scarcely less forward condition, swayed and bent, dark against the blinding glare of the sun. And beyond this fringe was the silhouette of a plant mass, branching clumsily like a cactus and swelling, visibly swelling like a bladder that fills with air. Then to the westward also, I discovered that another such distended form was rising over the scrub. But here the light fell upon its sleek sides, and I could see that its color was a vivid orange hue. It rose as one watched it, if one looked away from it from a minute and then back. Its outline had changed. It thrust out blunt, congested branches until, in a little time, it rose a coralline shape of many feet in height. Compared with such a growth, the terrestrial puffball, which will sometimes swell a foot in diameter, in a single night would be a hopeless laggard. But then, the puffball grows against the gravitational pull, 6 times that of the moon, beyond, out of gullies and flats that had been hidden from us, but not from the quickening sun, over reefs and banks of shining rock. A bristling beard of spiky and fleshy vegetation was straining into view, hurrying tumultuously to take advantage of the brief day in which it must flower and fruit and seed again and die. It was like a miracle, that growth, so one must imagine. The trees and plants arose at the creation and cover the desolation of the new-made earth. Imagine it, imagine that dawn, the resurrection of the frozen air, the stirring and quickening of the soil. And then this silent uprising of vegetation, this unearthly ascent of fleshiness and spikes, conceive it all by a blaze that would make the intense sunlight of earth seem watery and weak and still around this stirring jungle. Wherever there was shadow lingered banks of bluish snow. And to have the picture of our impression complete, you must bear in mind that we saw it all through a thick, bent glass, distorting it as things are distorted by a lens, acute only in the center of the picture, and very bright there and towards the edges, magnified and unreal. Chapter 9, Prospecting begins. We cease to gaze. We turn to each other, the same thought, the same question in our eyes. For these plants to grow, there must be some air, however attenuated air, that we also should be able to breathe. The manhole, I said. Yes, said Cavil, if it is air we see. In a little while, I said, these plants will be as high as we are. Suppose, after all, is it certain? How do you know that stuff is air? It may be nitrogen, it may be leung ki carbon dioxide trong kang ki. Even that's easy, he said, and set about proving it. He produced a big piece of crumpled paper from the bale, lit it and thrust it hastily through the manhole valve. I bent forward and peered down through the thick glass. for its appearance outside, that little flame on whose evidence depended so much. I saw the paper drop out and lie lightly upon the snow. The pink flame of its burning vanished. For an instant, it seemed to be extinguished. And then I saw a little blue tongue upon the edge of it, that trembled and crept and spread quietly. The whole sheet save word Lane, in immediate contact with the snow, charred and shriveled, and sent up a quivering thread of smoke. There was no doubt left to me. The atmosphere of the moon was either pure oxygen, or air incapable, therefore, unless its tenuity was excessive, of supporting our alien life. We might emerge and live. I sat down with my legs on either side of the manhole and prepared to unscrew it, but Cavil stopped me. "There's first a little precaution," he said. He pointed out that, although it was certainly an oxygenated atmosphere, outside it might still be so rarefied as to cause us grave injury. He reminded me of mountain sickness and of the bleeding that often afflicts aeronauts who have ascended too swiftly, and he spent some time in the preparation of a sickly tasting drink which he insisted on my sharing. It made me feel a little numb, but otherwise had no effect on me. Then he permitted me to begin. Unscrewing presently, the glass stopper of the manhole was so far undone that the dense air within our sphere began to escape along the thread of the screw, singing as a kettle sings before it boils. Thereupon he made me desist. It speedily became evident that the pressure outside was very much less than it was within. How much less it was we had no means of telling. I sat grasping the stopper with both hands, ready to close it again if, in spite of our intense hope, the lunar atmosphere should after all prove too rare. Fight for us, and Cavil sat with a cylinder of compressed oxygen at hand. To restore our pressure, we looked at one another in silence, and then at the fantastic vegetation that swayed and grew visibly and noiselessly without. And ever that shrill piping continued. My blood vessels began to throb in my ears, and the sound of Caval's movements diminished. I noted how still everything had become because of the thinning of the air. As our air sizzled out from the screw, the moisture of it condensed in little puffs. Presently I experienced a peculiar shortness of breath that lasted indeed during the whole of the time of our exposure to the moon's exterior atmosphere, and a rather unpleasant sensation about the ears and fingernails and the back of the throat grew upon my attention and presently pass off again. But then came vertigo and nausea that abruptly changed the quality of my courage. I gave the lid of the manhole half a turn and made a hasty explanation to Cavil, but now he was the more sanguine. He answered me in a voice that seemed extraordinarily small and remote because of the thinness of the air that carried the sound. He recommended a nip of brandy and set me the example, and presently I felt better. I turned the manhole stopper back again. The throbbing in my ears grew louder, and then I remarked that the piping note of the outrush had ceased. For a time I could not be sure that it had ceased. "Well," said Cavil in the ghost of a voice. "Well, shall we go on?" I thought. "Is this all? If you can stand it," by way of answer. I went on unscrewing. I lifted the circular perculum from its place and laid it carefully on the bale. A flake or so of snow whirled and vanished as that thin and unfamiliar air took possession of our sphere. I knelt and then seated myself at the edge of the manhole. Peering over it, beneath, within a yard of my face, lay the untrodden snow of the moon. There came a little pause. How eyes met. "It doesn't distress your lungs too much," said Cavil. "No," I said. "I can stand this." He stretched out his hand for his blanket, thrust his head through its central hole, and wrapped it about him. He sat down on the edge of the manhole. He let his feet to drop until they were within 6 inches of the lunar ground. He hesitated for a moment, then thrust himself forward dropped these intervening inches, and stood upon the untrodden soil of the moon. As he stepped forward, he was refracted grotesquely by the edge of the glass. He stood for a moment looking this way and that. Then he drew himself together and leapt. The glass distorted everything. But it seemed to me even then to be an extremely big leap. He had one bound become remote. He seemed 20 or 30 feet off. He was standing high upon a rocky mass and gesticulating back to me. Perhaps he was shouting, but the sound did not reach me. But how the ducha had he done this, I felt. Like a man who has just seen a new conjuring trick. In a puzzled state of mind, I too dropped through the manhole. I stood up, just in front of me. The snow drift had fallen away and made a sort of ditch. I made a step and jumped. I found myself flying through the air. Saw the rock on which he stood coming to meet me. Clutched it and clung in a state of infinite amazement. I gasped a painful laugh. I was tremendously confused. Cavil bent down and shouted in piping tones for me to be careful. I had forgotten that on the moon, with only an eighth part of the Earth's mass and a quarter of its diameter, my weight was barely a sixth what it was on Earth. But now that fact insisted on being remembered. We are out of Mother Earth's leading strings now, he said. With a guarded effort, I raised myself to the top, and moving as cautiously as a rheumatic patient, stood up beside him under the blaze of the sun. The sphere lay behind us on its dwindling snow drift, 30 feet away, as far as the eye could see. Over the enormous disorder of the rocks that formed the crater floor, the same bristling scrub that surrounded us was starting into life, diversified here and there by bulging masses of a cactus form and scarlet and purple lichens that grew so fast. They seemed to crawl over the rocks. The whole area of the crater seemed to me then to be one similar wilderness, up to the very foot of the surrounding cliff. This cliff was apparently bare of vegetation, save at its base and with buttresses and terraces and platforms. That did not very greatly attract our attention. At the time, it was many miles away from us in every direction. We seemed to be almost at the center of the crater, and we saw it through a certain haziness that drove before the wind. For there was even a wind now in the thin air, a swift yet weak wind that chilled exceedingly, but exerted little pressure. It was blowing around the crater, as it seemed to the hot illuminated side, from the foggy darkness under the sunward wall. It was difficult to look into this eastward fog. We had to peer with half-closed eyes beneath the shade of our hands. Because of the fierce intensity of the motionless sun, it seems to be deserted, said Cavil. Absolutely desolate. I looked about me again. I retained even then a clinging hope of some quasi-human evidence, some pinnacle of building, some house or engine. But everywhere one looked, spread the tumbled rocks and peaks and crests and the darting scrub, and those bulging cacti that swelled and swelled. A flat negation, as it seemed, of all such hope. It looks as though these plants had it to themselves. I said, I see no trace of any other creature. No insects, no birds, no, not a trace, but a scrap, no particle of animal life. If there was, what would they do in the night? No, there's just these plants alone. I shaded my eyes with my hand. It's like the landscape of a dream. These things are less like earthly land plants than the things one imagines among the rocks at the bottom of the sea. Oh, look at that yonder. One might imagine it a lizard changed into a plant. Oh, and the glare. This is only the fresh morning, said Cavil. He sighed and looked about him. This is no world for men, he said. And yet in a way, it appeals. He became silent for a time, then commenced his meditative humming. I started at a gentle touch, and found a thin sheet of livid lichen lapping over my shoe. I kicked at it, and it fell to powder, and each speck began to grow. I heard Cavil exclaim sharply, and perceived that one of the fixed bayonets of the scrub had pricked him. He hesitated, his eyes sought among the rocks about us. A sudden blaze of pink had crept up a ragged pillar of crag. It was a most extraordinary pink. A livid magenta look, said I, turning, and behold, Cavil had vanished. For an instant I stood transfixed. Then I made a hasty step to look over the verge of the rock, but in my surprise at his disappearance, I forgot once more that we were on the moon. The thrust of my foot that I made in striding would have carried me a yard on Earth. On the moon it carried me 6, a good 5 yards over the edge. For the moment the thing had something of the effect of those nightmares. When one falls and falls, for a while, one falls 16 feet. In the first second of a fall on Earth, on the moon one falls too. And with only a sixth of one's weight, I fell rather. I jumped down about 10 yards. I suppose it seemed to take quite a long time. 5 or 6 seconds I should think. I floated through the air and fell like a feather, knee-deep in a snow drift, in the bottom of a gully of blue-gray, white-veined rock. I looked about me. Cavall, I cried. But no Cavall was visible. Cavo. I cried louder and the rocks echoed me. I turned fiercely to the rocks and clambered to the summit of them. Cavo, I cried. My voice sounded like the voice of a lost lamb. The sphere was not in sight, and for a moment, a horrible feeling of desolation pinched my heart. Then I saw him. He was laughing and gesticulating to attract my attention. He was on a bare patch of rock 20 or 30 yards away. I could not hear his voice, but jumps at his gestures. I hesitated. The distance seemed enormous. Yet I reflected that surely I must be able to clear a greater distance than Cavil. I made a step back, gathered myself together, and left. With all my might I seemed to shoot right up in the air, as though I should never come down. It was horrible and delightful, and as wild as a nightmare. To go flying off in this fashion, I realized my leap had been altogether too violent. I flew clean over Cavall's head and beheld a spiky confusion in a gully. Spreading to meet my fall, I gave a yelp of alarm. I put out my hands and straightened my legs. I hit a huge fungoid bulk that burst all about me, scattering a mass of orange spores in every direction and covering me with orange powder. I rolled about, splattering, and came to rest, convulsed with breathless laughter. I became aware of Cavill's little round face peering over a bristling hedge. He shouted some fated inquiry. Hey, I tried to shout, but could not do so for want of breath. He made his way towards me, coming gingerly among the bushes. We've got to be careful, he said. This moon has no discipline. She let us match ourselves. He helped me to my feet. You exerted yourself too much, he said, dabbing at the yellow stuff with his hand. To remove it from my garments, I stood passive and panting, allowing him to beat off the jelly from my knees and elbows and lecture me upon my misfortunes. We don't quite allow for the gravitation. Our muscles are scarcely educated yet. We must practice a little when you have got your breath. I pulled 2 or 3 little thorns out of my hand and sat for a time on a boulder of rock. My muscles were quivering, and I had that feeling of personal disillusionment that comes at the first fall. To the learner of cycling on Earth, it suddenly occurred to Cavil that the cold air in the gully, after the brightness of the sun, might give me a fever. So we clambered back into the sunlight. We found that beyond a few abrasions, I had received no serious injuries from my tumble, and at Cavil's suggestion, we were presently looking round for some safe and easy landing place for my next leap. We chose a rocky slab some 10 yards off, separated from us by a little thicket of olive green spikes. Imagine it there, said Cavil, who was assuming the ears of a trainer, and he pointed to a spot about 4 feet from my toes. This leap I managed without difficulty, and I must confess, I found a certain satisfaction in Cavil's falling short by a foot or so and tasting the spikes of the scrub. One has to be careful, you see, he said, pulling out his thorns. And with that he ceased to be my mentor and became my fellow learner in the art of locomotion. We chose a still easier jump and did it without difficulty, and then leapt back again. Then to and fro several times, accustoming our muscles to the new standard. I could never have believed, had not experienced it, how rapid that adaptation would be in a very little time indeed. Certainly after fewer than 30 leaps, we could judge the effort necessary for a distance, with almost terrestrial assurance, and all this time, the lunar plants were growing around us, higher and denser and more entangled every moment, thicker and taller spiked plants, green cactus masses, fungi, fleshy and lichenous things, strangest radiate and sinuous shapes. But we were so intent upon our leaping that for a time, we gave no heed to their unfaltering expansion. An extraordinary elation had taken possession of us. Partly, I think, it was our sense of release from the confinement of the sphere. Mainly, however, the thin sweetness of the air, which I am certain contained a much larger proportion of oxygen than our terrestrial atmosphere, in spite of the strange quality of all about us. I felt as adventurous and experimental as a cockney would do, placed for the first time among mountains. And I do not think it occurred to either of us, face to face though we were with the unknown, to be very greatly afraid. We were bitten by a spirit of enterprise. We selected a Leichner's copier, perhaps 15 yards away, and landed neatly on its summit. One after the other, good, we cried to each other, oh, good, and cover, made 3 steps, and went off to a tempting slope of snow. A good 20 yards and more beyond, I stood for a moment, struck by the grotesque effect of his soaring figure, his dirty cricket cap and spiky hair, his little round body, his arms and his knickerbockered legs, tucked up tightly against the weird spaciousness of the lunar scene. A gust of laughter seized me, and then I stepped off to follow. Plump I dropped beside him. We made a few gargantuan strides, let 3 or 4 times more, and sat down at last in a likeness hollow. Our lungs were painful. We sat holding our sides and recovering our breath, looking appreciation to one another. Cavil panted something about amazing sensations, and then came a thought into my head. For the moment, it did not seem a particularly appalling thought, simply a natural question arising out of the situation. By the way, I said, where exactly is the sphere? Cavo looked at me. The full meaning of what we were saying struck me sharply. Cavo, I cried, laying a hand on his arm, where's the sphere? Chapter 10, Lost Men in the Moon. His face caught something of my dismay. He stood up and stared about him, at the scrub that fenced us in and rose about us. Straining upward in a passion of growth, he put a dubious hand to his lips. He spoke with a sudden lack of assurance. I think he said slowly, we left it, somewhere, about there. He pointed a hesitating finger that wavered in an arc. I'm not sure. His look of consternation deepened anyhow. He said with his eyes on me, it can't be far. We had both stood up. We made unmeaning ejaculations. Our eyes sought in the twining, thickening jungle round about us. All about us on the sunlit slopes frothed and swayed, the darting shrubs, the swelling cactus, the creeping lichens, and wherever the shade remained, the snow drifts lingered north, south, east, and west, spread in identical monotony of unfamiliar forms. And somewhere, buried already among this tangled confusion, was our sphere, our home, our only provision, our only hope of escape from this fantastic wilderness of ephemeral growth into which we had come. I think after all, he said, pointing suddenly. It might be over there. No, I said. We have turned in a curve. See, here is the mark of my heels. It's clear the thing must be more to the eastward. Much more. No, the sphere must be over there. I think that cover. I kept the sun upon my right all the time. Every leap, it seems to me, I said, my shadow flew before me. We stared into one another's eyes. The area of the crater had become enormously vast to our imaginations. the growing thickets already impenetrably dense. Good heavens, oh, what fools we have been! It's evident that we must find it again," said Kavil, "and that soon the sun grows stronger. We should be fainting with the heat already. If it wasn't so dry, and I'm hungry." I stared at him. I had not suspected this aspect of the matter before, but it came to me at once, a positive craving, yes. I said with emphasis, "I am hungry too." He stood up with a look of active resolution. Certainly we must find the sphere, as calmly as possible. We surveyed the interminable reefs and thickets that form the floor of the crater, each of us weighing in silence the chances about finding the sphere before we were overtaken by heat and hunger. "It can't be 50 yards from here," said Cover with indecisive gestures. "The only thing is to beat roundabout. Until we come upon it, that is all we can do," I said without any alacrity, "to begin our hunt. I wish this confounded spike bush did not grow so fast. That's just it," said Cover. But it was lying on a bank of snow. I stared about me in the vain hope of recognizing some knoll or shrub that had been near the sphere. But everywhere was a confusing sameness. Everywhere the aspiring bush, the descending fungi, the dwindling snowbank steadily and inevitably changed. The sun scorched and stung, the fakeness of an unaccountable hunger, mingled without infinite perplexity, and even as we stood there, confused and lost amidst unprecedented things, we became aware for the first time of a sound upon the moon, other than the air of the growing plants, the faint sighing of the wind, or those that we ourselves had made. Boom, 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 it came from beneath our feet. A sound in the earth. We seemed to hear it with our feet, as much as with our ears. Its dull resonance was muffled by distance, thick with the quality of intervening substance. No sound that I can imagine could have astonished us more, or have changed more completely the quality of things about us, for this sound rich, slow and deliberate seemed to us as though it could be nothing but the striking of some gigantic, buried clock. Boom, 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 sound suggestive of still cloisters, of sleepless nights in crowded cities, of vigils and the awaited hour, of all that is orderly and methodical in life, booming out pregnant and mysterious. In this fantastic desert to the eye, everything was unchanged. The desolation of bushes and cacti, waving silently in the wind, stretched unbroken to the distant cliffs. The still dark sky was empty overhead, and the hot sun hung and burned, and through it all a warning. A threat throbbed this enigma of sound. Boom, boom, boom. We questioned one another in faint and faded voices. Look like a clock. What is it? What can it be? Count was Cavil's belated suggestion. And at that word the striking ceased. The silence, the rhythmic disappointment of the silence, came as a fresh shock. For a moment, one could doubt whether one had ever heard a sound, or whether it might not still be going on. Had I indeed heard a sound? I felt the pressure of Cavil's hand upon my arm. He spoke in an undertone, as though he feared to wake some sleeping thing. "Let us keep together," he whispered, "and look for the sphere. We must get back to the sphere. This is beyond our understanding. Which way shall we go?" He hesitated. An intense persuasion of presences, of unseen things about us and near us, dominated our minds. What could they be? Where could they be? Was this arid desolation ultimately frozen and scorched? Only the outer rind and mask of some subterranean world, and if so, what sort of world, what sort of inhabitants might it not presently disgorge upon us? And then, stabbing the aching stillness, as vivid and sudden as an unexpected thunderclap, came a clang and rattle as though great gates of metal had suddenly been flung apart. It arrested our steps. We stood gaping helplessly. Then Cavil stole towards me. "I do not understand," he whispered close to my face. He waved his hand vaguely skyward. The vague suggestion of still, vague thoughts hiding place if anything came. I looked about us, I nodded my head and assent him. We started off moving stealthily, with the most exaggerated precautions against noise. We went towards a thicket of scrub, a clangor like hammers flung about a boiler. Hastened our steps. We must crawl, whispered Cattle. The lower leaves of the bayonet plants, already overshadowed by the newer ones above, were beginning to wilt and shrivel so that we could thrust our way in among the thickening stems without serious injury. A stab in the face or arm we did not heed. At the heart of the thicket, I stopped and stared, panting, into Cavill's face. Subterranean, he whispered, below. They may come out. We must find the sphere. Yes, I said. But how? Crawl till we come to it. But if we don't, keep hidden, see what they are like. We will keep together, said I, he thought. Which way shall we go? We must take our chance. We paired this way and that, then very circumspectly we began to crawl through the lower jungle, making so far as we could judge a circuit, halting now at every waving fungus, at every sound, intent only on the sphere, from which we had so foolishly emerged ever and again. From out of the earth beneath us came concussions, beatings strange, inexplicable mechanical sounds, and once and then again we thought we heard something. A faint rattle and tumult borne to us through the air. Too fearful as we were, we dared essay no vantage point to survey the crater. For long we saw nothing of the beings, whose sounds were so abundant and insistent, but for the faintness of our hunger and the drying of our throats, that crawling would have had the quality of a very vivid dream. It was so absolutely unreal. The only element with any touch of reality was these sounds. Picture it to yourself about us. The dreamlike jungle, with the silent bayonet leaves darting overhead, and the silent, vivid sun splash lichens under our hands and knees, waving with the vigor of their growth, as a carpet waves when the wind gets beneath it. Ever and again one of the bladder fungi, bulging and descending under the sun, loomed upon us. Ever and again some novel shape in vivid color obtruded. The very cells that built up these plants were as large as my thumb, like beads of colored glass. And all these things were saturated in the unmitigated glare of the sun, was seen against the sky. That was bluish black and spangled still, in spite of the sunlight, with a few surviving stars. Strange. The very forms and textures of the stones were strange. It was all strange. The feeling of one's body was unprecedented. Every other movement ended in a surprise. The breath sucked thin in one's throat. The blood flowed through one's ears. And a throbbing tide thought, and ever and again came gusts of turmoil, hammering the clanging and throb of machinery. And presently the bellowing of great beasts. Chapter 11. The Mooncraft Pastures. So we, to poor terrestrial castaways lost in that wild, growing moon jungle, crawled in terror. Before the sounds that had come upon us, we crawled as it seemed a long time, before we saw either selenite or moon calf, though we heard the bellowing and gruntulous noises of these latter continually drawing nearer to us. We crawled through stony ravines, over snow slopes, amidst fungi that ripped like thin bladders, at our thrust emitting a watery humor, over a perfect pavement of things like puffballs, and beneath interminable thickets of scrub. And ever more helplessly, our eyes sought for our abundant sphere. The noise of the moon calves would at times be a vast, flat calf-like sound. At times it rose to an amazed and wrathy bellowing, and again it would become a clogged bestial sound, as though these unseen creatures had sought to eat and bellow at the same time. Our first view was but an inadequate transitory glimpse, yet none the less disturbing because it was incomplete. Cavill was crawling in front of the time, and he first was aware of their proximity. He stopped dead, arresting me with a single gesture. A crackling and smashing of the scrub appeared to be advancing directly upon us, and then as we squatted close, and endeavored to judge off the nearness and direction of this noise. They came a terrific bellow behind us, so close and vehement that the tops of the bayonet scrub bent before it, and one felt the breath of it, hot and moist and turning about. We saw indistinctly through a crowd of swaying stems, the moon cuff's shining sides, and the long line of its back loomed out against the sky. Of course, it is hard for me now to say how much I saw that time, because my impressions were corrected by subsequent observation. First of all, impressions was its enormous size. The girth of its body was some 4 square feet, its length perhaps to 100. Its size rose and fell with its labored breathing. I perceived that its gigantic, flabby body lay along the ground, and that its skin was of a corrugated white, dappling into blackness along the backbone. But of its feet we saw nothing. I think also we saw then the profile, at least of the almost brainless head, with its fat incumbent neck, its slobbering omnivorous mouth, its little nostrils and tight-shut eyes, for the moon calf invariably shut its eyes in the presence of the sun. We had a glimpse of a vast red pit as it opened its mouth to bleed and bellow again. We had a breath from the pit, and then the monster heeled over like a ship, dragged forward along the ground, creasing all its leathery skin, rolled again, and so wallowed past smashing a path amidst the scrub, and was speedily hidden from our eyes by the dense interlacings beyond. Another appeared more distantly, and then another, and then as though he was guiding these animated lumps of providence to their pasture. A selenite came momentarily into ken. My grip upon Cavill's foot became convulsive at the sight of him, and we remained motionless and peering long after he had passed out of our range. By contrast with the moon calves, he seemed a trivial being, a mere ant scarcely 5 feet high. He was wearing garments of some leathery substance, so that no portion of his actual body appeared. But of this, of course, we were entirely ignorant. He presented himself, therefore, as a compact, bristling creature, having much of the quality of a complicated insect, with whip-like tentacles and a clanging arm projecting from his shining, cylindrical body case. The form of his head was hidden by his enormous many-spiked helmet. We discovered afterwards that he used the spikes for prodding refractory moon calves, and a pair of goggles of darkened glass, set very much at the side, gave a bird-like quality to the metallic apparatus that covered his face. His arms did not project beyond this body case, and he carried himself upon short legs that wrapped, though they were in warm coverings, seemed to our terrestrial eyes inordinately flimsy. They had very short thighs, very long shanks, and little feet. In spite of his heavy-looking clothing, he was progressing with what would be, from the terrestrial point of view, very considerable strides, and his clanging arm was busy. The quality of his motion, during the incident of his passing, suggested haste and a certain anger. And soon after we had lost sight of him, we heard the bellow of a moon calf change abruptly into a short, sharp squeal, followed by the scuffle of its acceleration, and gradually that bellowing receded and then came to an end, as if the pasture's sort had been attained. We listened for a space. The moon world was still, but it was some time before we resumed out crawling, search for the vanished sphere, when next we saw moon calves. They were some little distance away from us, in a place of tumbled rocks. The less vertical surfaces of the rocks were thick, with a speckled green plant growing in dense, mossy clumps upon which these creatures were browsing. We stopped at the edge of the reeds, amidst which we were crawling. At the sight of them, peering out of them, and looking around for a second glimpse of a selenite, they lay against their food like stupid slugs. Huge greasy hulls, eating greedily and noisily, with a sort of sobbing avidity. They seemed monsters of mere fatness, clumsy and overwhelmed, to a degree that would make a Smithfield ox seem a model of agility. Their busy writhing chewing, mouths and eyes closed, together with the appetizing sound of their munching, made up an effective animal enjoyment that was singularly stimulating to our empty frames. Hogs, said Cavil with unusual passion. Disgusting hogs, and after one glare of angry envy, crawled off through the bush to our right. I stayed long enough to see that the speckled plant was quite hopeless for human nourishment and crawled after him, nibbling a quill of it between my teeth. Presently, we were arrested again by the proximity of a selenite, and this time we were able to observe him more exactly. Now we could see that the selenite covering was indeed clothing, and not a sort of crustacean integument. He was quite similar in his costume to the former when we had glimpsed, except that ends of something like wadding were protruding from his neck, and he stood on a promontory of rock and moved his head this way and that. As though he was surveying the crater, we lay quite still, fearing to attract his attention if we moved. And after a time he turned about and disappeared. We came upon another drove of moon carbs, bellowing up a ravine, and then we passed over a place of sounds of beating machinery, as if some huge hall of industry came near the surface there. And while these sounds were still about us, we came to the edge of a great open space, perhaps 100 yards in diameter and perfectly level, save for a few lichens that advanced from its margins. This space was bare and presented a powdery surface of a dusty yellow color. We were afraid to strike out across this space, but as it presented less obstruction to our crawling than the scrub, we went down upon it and began very circumspectly to skirt its edge. For a little while, the noises from below ceased, and everything, save for the faint stir of the growing vegetation, was very still. Then abruptly they began an uproar, louder, more vehement, and nearer than any we had so far heard. Of a certainty, it came from below. Instinctively we crouched as flat as we could, ready for a prompt plunge into the thicket beside us. Each knock and throb seemed to vibrate through our bodies. Louder grew this throbbing and beating, and that irregular vibration increased, until the whole moon world seemed to be jerking and pulsing. "Cover," whispered Cavil, and I turned towards the bush. At that instant came a thud, like the thud of a gun, and then a thing happened. It still haunts me in my dreams. I had turned my head to look at Cavil's face, and thrust out my hand in front of me. As I did so, and my hand met nothing, I plunged suddenly into a bottomless hole. My chest hit something hard, and I found myself with my chin on the edge of an unfathomable abyss that suddenly opened beneath me, my hand extended stiffly into the void. The whole of that flat, circular area was no more than a gigantic lid that was now sliding sideways from off the pit it at, covered into a slot prepared for it. Had it not been for cover, I think I should have remained rigid, hanging over this margin and staring into the enormous gulf below, until at last the edges of the slot scraped me off and held me into its depths. But Cavil had not received the shock that had paralyzed me. He had been a little distance from the edge with the lid at first opened, and perceiving the peril that held me helpless, gripped my legs and pulled me backwards. I came into a sitting position, crawled away from the edge for a space on all fours, then staggered up and ran after him. Across the thundering, quivering sheet of metal, it seemed to be, swinging open with a steadily accelerated velocity. And the bushes in front of me shifted sideways as I ran. I was none too soon. Cavil's back vanished amidst the bristling thicket, and as I scrambled up after him, the monstrous valve came into position with a clang. For a long time we lay panting, not daring to approach the pit, but at last very cautiously and bit by bit, we crept into a position from which we could peer down. The bushes about us creaked and waved with the force of a breeze that was blowing down the shaft. We could see nothing at first, except smooth vertical walls, descending at last into an impenetrable black. And then very gradually, we became aware of a number of very faint and little lights going to and fro. For a time, that stupendous gulf of mystery held us, so that we forgot even our sphere in time. As we grew more accustomed to the darkness, we could make out very small, dim elusive shapes moving about. Among those needlepoint illuminations, we appeared amazed and incredulous, understanding so little that we could find no words to say. We could distinguish nothing that would give us a clue to the meaning of the faint shapes we saw. What can it be? I asked, what can it be? The engineering. They must live in these caverns during the night and come out during the day. Cavil, I said. Can they be that it was something like men? That was not a man. We dare risk nothing. We dare do nothing until we find the sphere. We can do nothing until we find the sphere. He ascended with a groan and stirred himself to move. He stared about him for a space side and indicated a direction. We struck out through the jungle. For a time we crawled resolutely, then with diminishing figure. Presently among great shapes of flabby purple. They came in noise of trampling and cries about us. We lay close, and for a long time, the sounds went to and fro and very near. But this time we saw nothing. I tried to whisper to cover that. I could hardly go without food much longer. But my mouth had become too dry for whispering. Cavil, I said, I must have food. He turned a face full of dismay towards me. It's a case for holding out. He said, but I must, I said. Look at my lips. I've been thirsty some time. If only some of that snow would remained. It's clean gone. We're driving from Arctic to tropical, at the rate of a degree a minute. I nod my hand. The sphere, he said. There's nothing for it but the sphere. We rouse ourselves to another spurt of crawling. My mind ran entirely on edible things, on the hissing profundity of summer drinks. More particularly, I craved for beer. I was haunted by the memory of a 16-gallon cask that had swaggered in my limb cellar. I thought of the adjacent lotta, and especially of steak and kidney pie. Tender steak and plenty of kidney and rich, thick gravy between ever and again. I was seized with fits of hungry yawning. We came to flat places overgrown with fleshy red things, monstrous coralline growth. As we pushed against them, they snapped and broke. I noted the quality of the broken surfaces, the confounded stuff. Certainly looks of a biteable texture. Then it seemed to me that it smelt rather well. I picked up a fragment and sniffed at it. Cavil, I said in a hoarse undertone. He glanced at me with his face screwed up. Don't, he said. I put down the fragment and be crawled on through this tempting flashiness for a space. Cavil, I asked. Why not poison? I heard him say. But he did not look around. We crawled some way before I decided. No chance it, said I. He made a belated gesture to prevent me. I stuffed my mouth full. He crouched watching my face. His own twisted into the oddest expression. It's good, I said. Oh Lord, he cried. He watched me munch. His face wrinkled between desire and disapproval, then suddenly succumbed to appetite and began to tear off huge mouthfuls. For a time we did nothing but eat. The stuff was not unlike a terrestrial mushroom, only it was much laxer in texture. And as one swallowed it, it warmed the throat. At first we experienced the mere mechanical satisfaction in eating. Then our blood began to run warmer, and we tingled at the lips and fingers. And then new and slightly irrelevant ideas came bubbling up in our minds. It's good, said I, infernally good. What a home for our surplus population, a poor surplus population. And I broke off another large portion. It filled me with a curiously benevolent satisfaction that there was such good food in the moon. The depression of my hunger gave way to an irrational acceleration. The dread and discomfort in which I had been living vanished entirely. I perceived the moon no longer as a planet from which I most earnestly desire the means of escape, but as a possible refuge from human destitution. I think I forgot the selenites the moon carves, the lid and the noises completely, so soon as I had eaten that fungus. Kavil replied to my third repetition of my surplus population remark. With similar words of approval, I felt that my head swam. But I put this down to the stimulating effect of food. After a long fast, excellence, discovery yours. Kavil said, I send only to the Tato. What do you mean, last Kavil? Discovery of the moon send only to the Tato. I looked at him, shocked at his suddenly hoarse voice. And by the badness of his articulation, it occurred to me in a flash that he was intoxicated. Possibly by the fungus, it also occurred to me that he earned. In imagining that he had discovered the moon. He had not discovered it, he had only reached it. I tried to lay my hand on his arm and explain this to him. But the issue was too subtle for his brain. It was also unexpectedly difficult to express. After a momentary attempt to understand me, I remember wondering if the fungus had made my eyes as fishy as his. He set off upon some observations on his own account. We are, he announced with a solemn hiccup, the creatures owe. What we eat and drink, he repeated this. And as I was now in one of my subtle moods, I determined to dispute it. Possibly I wondered a little from the point. But Kavil certainly did not attend at all properly. He stood up as well as he could, putting a hand on my head to study himself, which was disrespectful, and stood staring about him, quite void now of any fear of the moon beings. I tried to point out that this was dangerous, for some reason that was not perfectly clear to me. But the word dangerous had somehow got mixed with indiscreet, and came out rather more like injurious than either. And after an attempt to disentangle them, I resumed my argument, addressing myself principally to the unfamiliar, but attentive coralline growth on either side. I felt that it was necessary to clear up this confusion. Between the moon and a potato, at once I wandered into a long parenthesis on the importance of precision, of definition and argument. I did my best to ignore the fact that my bodily sensations were no longer agreeable. In some way that I have now forgotten, my mind was led back to projects of colonization. We must annex this moon, I said. There must be no Shelley. This is part of the white man's birth in Kavil. We are set up, mean it's a traps empire season. Never dreamt pin in all the newspapers. Cavalry Sial Bedfordisha. Bedfordisha, limited, mean unlimited, practically certainly, I was intoxicated. I embarked upon an argument to show the infinite benefits our arrival would confer on the moon. I involved myself in a rather difficult proof that the arrival of Columbus was on the whole beneficial to America. I found I had forgotten the line of argument I had intended to pursue and continue to repeat. Similar to Columbus, to fill up time, from that point, my memory of the action of that abominable fungus becomes confused. I remember vaguely that we declared our intention of standing. No nonsense from any confounded insects, that we decided it'll became men, to hide shamefully upon a mere satellite, but we equipped ourselves with huge armfuls of the fungus, whether for missile purposes or not, I do not know, and heedless of the stabs of the bayonet scrub, we started forth into the sunshine. Almost immediately, we must have come upon the selenite. There were 6 of them, and they were marching in single file over a rocky place, making their most remarkable piping and whining sounds. They all seemed to become aware of us at once. All instantly became silent and motionless, like animals with their faces turned towards us. For a moment I was sobered. Insects, mermaid cover insects. And they think I'm going to crawl about on my stomach. On my vertebrated stomach. Stomach, he repeated slowly as though he chewed the indignity. Then suddenly, with a sort of fury, he made 3 vast strides and leapt towards them. He leapt badly. He made a series of somersaults in the air, whirled right over them, and vanished with an enormous splash. Amidst the cactus bladders, what the Selenites made of this amazing and, to my mind, undignified eruption from another planet, I have no means of guessing. I seem to remember the sight of their backs as they ran in all directions. But I'm not sure all these last incidents before oblivion came are vague and fainted my mind. I know I made a step to follow Cavil, and tripped and fell headlong among the rocks. I am certain, suddenly and vehemently ill. I seem to remember a violent struggle and being gripped by metallic clasps. My next clear recollection is that we were prisoners at we knew not what depths beneath the moon's surface. We were in darkness amidst strange distracting noises. Our bodies were covered with scratches and bruises, and our heads racked with pain. Chapter 12, The Selenite's Face. I found myself sitting, crouched together in a tumultuous darkness. For a long time I could not understand where I was, nor how I had come to this publicity. I thought of the cupboard into which I had been thrust, at times when I was a child, and then of a very dark and noisy bedroom in which I had slept during an illness. But these sounds about me were not the noises I had known, and there was a thin flavor in the air, like the wind of a stable. Then I suppose we might still be at work on the sphere, and that somehow I had got into the cellar of Caval's house. I remembered we had finished the sphere, and fancied I might still be in it, and traveling through space. Caval, I said, "Cannot we have some light?" There came no answer. Cavil, I insisted. I was answered by a groan. My head, I heard him say my head. I attempted to press my hands to my brow, which ached, and discovered they were tied together. This startled me very much. I brought them up to my mouth and felt the cold smoothness of metal. They were chained together. I tried to separate my legs, and made out they were similarly fastened, and also that I was fastened to the ground by a much thicker chain about the middle of my body. I was more frightened than I had yet been by anything in all our strange experiences. For a time I tugged silently at my bonds. "Caval," I cried out sharply, "why am I tied? Why have you tied me hand and foot?" "I haven't tied you," he answered. "It's the Selenites." The Selenites, my mind hung on that for a space. Then my memories came back to me. The snowy desolation, the thawing of the air. The growth of the plants are strange, hopping and crawling among the rocks and vegetation of the crater. All the distress of our frantic search for the sphere returned to me finally, the opening of the great lid that covered the pit. Then as I strained to trace our later movements, down to our present plight, the pain in my head became intolerable. I came to an insurmountable barrier. An obstinate blank cavil. "Yes, where are we? How should I know? Are we dead? What nonsense. They've got us then." He made no answer but a grunt. The lingering traces of the poison seemed to make him oddly irritable. "What do you mean to do?" "How should I know what to do?" "Know very well," said I, and became silent. Presently I was roused from a stupor. "Oh Lord," I cried, "I wish you'd stop that buzzing." We lapsed into silence again, listening to the dull confusion of noises, like the muffled sounds of a street door factory, that filled our ears. I could make nothing of it. My mind pursued first one rhythm and then another, and questioned it in vain. But after a long time, I became aware of a new and sharper element, not mingling with the rest, but standing out as it were, against that cloudy background of sound. It was a series of relatively very little definite sounds, tappings and rubbings, like a looser spray of ivy against a window, or a bird moving about upon a box. We listened and peered about us, but the darkness was a velvet pole. There followed a noise, like the subtle movement of the wards of a well-oiled lock, and then there appeared before me, hanging as it seemed in an immensity of black, a thin bright line. "Look," whispered Cavil very softly. "What is it?" "I don't know." We stared. The thin Bright line became a band and broader and paler. It took upon itself the quality of a bluish light. Falling upon a whitewashed wall, it ceased to be parallel-sided. It developed a deep indentation on one side. I turned to remark this to Kavil, and was amazed to see his ear in a brilliant illumination. All the rest of him in shadow. I twisted my head round. As well as my bonds would permit, Kabul, I said. Its behind his ear vanished, gave place to an eye. Suddenly the crack that had been admitting the light broadened out and revealed itself as the space of an opening door. Beyond was a sapphire vista, and in the doorway, steady grotesque outlines silhouetted against the glare. We both made convulsive efforts to turn, and failing sat staring over our shoulders at this. My first impression was of some clumsy quadruped. With lowered head, then I perceived it was the slender, pinched body and short and extremely attenuated, bandy legs of a selenite, with his head depressed between his shoulders. He was without the helmet and body covering they wear upon the exterior. He was a blank black figure to us, but instinctively, our imagination supplied features to his very human outline. I at least took it instantly that he was somewhat hunchbacked, with a high forehead and long features. He came forward 3 steps and paused for a time. His movement seemed absolutely noiseless. Then he came forward again. He walked like a bird. His feet fell one in front of the other. He stepped out of the ray of light that came through the doorway, and it seemed as though he vanished altogether in the shadow. For a moment my eyes saw him in the wrong place, and then I perceived him standing, facing us both in the full light. Only the human features I had attributed to him were not there at all. Of course, I ought to have expected that. Only I didn't. It came to me as an absolute. For a moment, an overwhelming shock. It seemed as though it wasn't a face, as though it must needs be a mask, a horror, a deformity that would presently be disavowed or explained. There was no nose, and the thing had dull bulging eyes at the side. In the silhouette I had supposed they were ears. There were no ears. I have tried to draw one of these heads, but I cannot. There was a mouth, downwardly curved, like a human mouth in a face that stares ferociously. The neck on which the head was poised was jointed in 3 places, almost like the short joint in the leg of a crab. The joints of the limbs I could not see, because of the putty-like straps in which they were swayed, and which formed the only clothing the being wore. There the thing was looking at us. At the time, my mind was taken up by the mad impossibility of the creature. I suppose he was also amazed, and with more reason. Perhaps for amazement than we only confound him. He did not show what we did, at least know what had brought about this meeting of incompatible creatures. But conceive how it would seem to decent Londoners, for example, to come upon a couple of living things as big as men, and absolutely unlike any other earthly animals, careering about among the sheep in Hyde Park. It must have taken him like that figure us. We were bound hand and foot, fagged and filthy, our beards 2 inches long, our faces scratched and bloody. Cavil, you must imagine, in his knickerbockers, torn in several places by the bayonet scrub, his Jaeger shirt and old cricket cap, his wiry hair wildly disordered, a tail to every quarter of the heavens. In that blue light his face did not look red, but very dark, his lips, and the drying blood upon my hands seemed black. If possible, I was in a worse plight than he, on account of the yellow fungus into which I had jumped. Our jackets were unbuttoned, and our shoes had been taken off and lay at our feet, and we were sitting with our backs to this queer, bluish light, peering at such a monster as Dura might have invented. Cavil broke the silence, started to speak, went hoarse and cleared his throat. Outside began a terrific bellowing, as if a moon calf were in trouble. It ended in a shriek, and everything was still again. Presently the selenite turned about, flickered into the shadow, stood for a moment retrospective at the door, and then closed in on us, on once more. We were in that murmurous mystery of darkness into which we had awakened. Chapter 13, Mr. Cavill makes some suggestions. For a time neither of us spoke, to focus together. All the things we had brought upon ourselves seemed beyond my mental powers. "They've got us," I said at last. "It was that fungus well. If I hadn't taken it, we should have fainted. And starved, we might have found the sphere." I lost my temper at his persistence and swore to myself. For a time we hated one another, in silence. I drummed with my fingers on the floor between my knees, and gritted the links of my fetus together. Presently, I was forced to talk again. "What do you make of it anyhow?" I asked humbly. "They are reasonable creatures. They can make things and do things. Those lights we saw." He stopped. It was clear he could make nothing of it. When he spoke again, it was to confess. After all, they are more human than we had a right to expect, I suppose. He stopped irritatingly. "Yes, I suppose anyhow. On any planet where there is an intelligent animal, it will carry its brain case upward and have hands and walk erect." Presently he broke away in another direction. "We are some way in," he said. "I mean perhaps a couple of 1,000 feet or more. Why-oh, it's cooler in hum. Our voices are so much louder, that faded quality, it is altogether gone. And the feeling in one's ears and throat. I have not noted that, but I did now. The air is denser, we must be some depths. A mile even we may be inside the moon. We never thought of a world inside the moon. No, how could we? We might have done, only one gets into habits of mind." He thought for a time. "No." He said, "It seems such an obvious thing. Oh, of course. The moon must be enormously cavernous, with an atmosphere within, and at the center of its caverns a sea. One knew that the moon had a lower, specific gravity than the Earth. One knew that it had little air or water outside. One knew, too, that it was sister planet to the Earth, and that it was unaccountable, that it should be different in composition. The inference that it was hollowed out was as clear as day, and yet one never saw it as a fact. Kepler, of course. His voice had the interest now, the man who has discerned a pretty sequence of reasoning. Yes, he said, Kepler with his sub-Vulvani was right after all. I wish you were taking the trouble to find that out. Before we came, I said. He answered nothing, buzzing to himself softly as he pursued his thoughts. My temper was going. What do you think has become of the sphere anyhow? I asked, lost, he said. Like a man who answers an uninteresting question, among those plants, unless they find it. And then how can I tell Cavill? I said with a sort of hysterical bitterness. Things look bright for my company. He made no answer. Good Lord, I exclaimed just. Think of all the trouble we took to get into this pickle. What did we come for? What are we after? What was the moon to us? Are we to the moon? We wanted too much. We tried too much. We ought to have started the little things first. It was you proposed the moon cover, right? Spring blinds, I'm certain. We could have worked them for terrestrial purposes. Certain. Did you really understand what I proposed? A steel cylinder rubbish, said Cavill. We ceased to converse for a time. Cavill kept up a broken monologue. Without much help from me. If they find it, he began. If they find it, what will they do with it? Well, that's a question. It may be that's the question. They won't understand it anyhow. If they understood that sort of thing, they would have come long since to the Earth. What do they? Why shouldn't they? But they would have sent something. They couldn't keep their hands off. Such a possibility, no, but they will examine it. Clearly they are intelligent and inquisitive. They will examine it, get inside it, trifle with the studs. Oh, that would mean the moon for us, for all the rest of our lives. Strange creatures, strange knowledge. As for strange knowledge, said I, and language failed me, look here. Bedford, said Cavil, you came on this expedition of your own free will. You said to me, call it prospecting. There's always risks in prospecting, especially when you do it unarmed. And without thinking out every possibility, I was so taken up with the sphere. The thing rushed on us and carried us away. Rushed on me. You mean rushed on me just as much? How was I to know, when I set to work on molecular physics, that the business would bring me here? Of all places, it's this accursed science. I cried, it's the very devil. The medieval priests and persecutors were right, and the moderns are all wrong. You tamper with it and it offers you gifts, and directly you take them. It knocks you to pieces in some unexpected way. Hold passions and new weapons. Now it upsets your religion. Now it upsets your social ideas. Now it whirls you off to desolation and misery. Anyhow, it's no use your quarreling with me now. These creatures, these Selenites, or whatever we choose to call them, have got us tied hand and foot. Whatever temper you choose to go through with it in, you will have to go through with it. We have experiences before us that will need all our coolness. He paused as if he required my assent, but I sat sulking. Found your science, I said. The problem is communication. Gestures, I fear, would be different. Pointing, for example. No creatures but men and monkeys point. That was too obviously wrong for me. Pretty nearly every animal, I cried, points with its eyes or nose. Cavil meditated over that. Yes, he said at last, and we don't. There's such differences, such differences. One might, but how can I tell? There is speech. The sounds they make, a sort of fluting and piping. I don't see how we are to imitate that. Is it this speech, that sort of thing? They may have different senses, different means of communication. Of course they are minds, and we are minds. There must be something in common. Who knows how far we may not get to an understanding? The things are outside us. I said they are more different from us than the strangest animals on earth. They are different clay. What is the good of talking like this? Cavil thought, I don't see that. Where there are minds, they will have something similar. Even though they have been evolved on different planets. Of course, it was a question of instincts. If we or they are no more than animals, well, are they? They're much more like ants on their hind legs than human beings. And whoever got to any sort of understanding with ants, but these machines and clothing? No, I don't hold with you, Bedford. The difference is wide. It's insurmountable. The resemblance must bridge it. I remember reading once a paper by the late Professor Colton on the possibility of communication between the planets. Unhappily, at that time, it did not seem probable that that would be of any material benefit to me, and I fear I did not give it the attention I should have done. In view of this state of affairs, yet, oh, now let me see. His idea was to begin with those broad truths that must underlie all conceivable mental existences, and establish a basis on those, the great principles of geometry to begin with. He proposed to take some leading proposition of Euclid's and show by construction that its truth was known to us. To demonstrate, for example, that the angles at the base of an isosceles triangle are equal, and that if the equal sides be produced, the angles on other sides of the base are equal also, or that the square on the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the squares on the two other sides. By demonstrating our knowledge of these things, we should demonstrate our possession of a reasonable intelligence. Now suppose I am I might draw the geometrical figure with a wet finger, or even trace it in the air. He felt silent. I sat meditating his words for a time. His wild hope of communication, of interpretation with these weird beings held me. Then that angry despair, that was a part of my exhaustion and physical misery, resumed its way, I perceived with a sudden novel vividness. The extraordinary folly of everything I had ever done. As I said, "Oh ass, unutterable ass I seem to exist, only to go about doing preposterous things. Why did we ever leave the thing? Coping about looking for patents and concessions in the craters of the moon. If only we had had the sense to fasten a handkerchief to a stick to show where we had left the sphere." I subsided, fuming. It is clear meditated cavil. They are intelligent. One can hypothete certain things, as they have not killed us at once. They must have ideas of mercy. Mercy at any rate of restraint, possibly of intercourse. They may meet us in this apartment and the glimpses we had of its guardian. These fetish a high degree of intelligence. Now I wish to heaven, cried I thought even twice. Plunge after plunge, first one fluky start and then another. It was my confidence in you. Oh, why didn't I stick to my play? That was what I was equal to. That was my world and the life I was made for. I could finish that play. I'm certain it was a good play. I had the scenario as good as done. Then conceive it leaping to the moon. Practically I've thrown my life away. That old woman in near Canterbury had better sense. I looked up and stopped in mid-sentence. The darkness had given place to that bluish light again. The door was opening and several noiseless Selenites were coming into the chamber. I became quite still, staring at their grotesque faces. Then suddenly my sense of disagreeable strangeness changed to interest. I perceived that the foremost and second carried bowls. One elemental need, at least our minds could understand in common. They were bowls of some metal that, like our factors, looked dark in that bluish light, and each contained a number of whitish fragments. All the cloudy pain and misery that oppressed me rushed together and took the shape of hunger. I hid these balls wolfishly, and though it returned to me in dreams, at that time it seemed a small matter that, at the end of the arms that lowered one towards me, were not hands, but a sort of flap and thumb, like the end of an elephant's trunk. The stuff in the bowl was loose in texture and whitish-brown in color, rather like lumps of some cold souffle, and it smelt faintly like mushrooms from a partially divided carcass of a moon calf that we presently saw. I am inclined to believe it must have been moon calf flesh. My hands were so tightly chained that I could barely contrive to reach the bowl, but when they saw the effort I made, two of them dexterously released one of the turns about my wrist. The tentacle hands were soft and cold to my skin. I immediately seized the mouthful of the food. It had the same lackness and texture that all organic structures seemed to have upon the moon. It tasted rather like a gafra or a damp meringue, but in no way was it disagreeable. I took 2 other mouthfuls. I wanted food, said I, tearing off a still larger piece. For a time, we ate with an utter absence of self-consciousness. We ate and presently drank like tramps in a soup kitchen. Never before nor since have I been hungry to the ravenous pitch, and say that I have had this very experience. I could never have believed that, 250,000 of miles out of our proper world, in utter perplexity of soul, surrounded, watched by beings more grotesque and inhuman than the worst creations of a nightmare, it would be possible for me to eat. In utter forgetfulness of all these things, they stood about us, watching us, and ever and again making a slight elusive twittering that stood, I suppose, in the stead of speech. I did not even shiver at the touch, and when the first zeal of my feeding was over, I could note that Cavil too had been eating with the same shameless abandon. Chapter 14. Experiments in Intercourse. When at last we had made an end of eating, the Selenites linked our hands closely together again, and then untwisted the chains about our feet and rebound them, so as to give us a limited freedom of movement. Then they unfastened the chains about our waists. To do all this they had to handle us freely, and ever and again one of their queer heads came down close to my face. or a soft tentacle hand touched my head or neck. I don't remember that I was afraid then, or repelled by their proximity. I think that our incurable anthropomorphism made us imagine there were human heads. Inside their masks, the skin, like everything else, looked bluish. But that was an account of the light. And it was hard and shiny, quite in the beetle wing fashion. Not soft or moist or hairy, as a vertebrated animal's would be. Along the crest of the head was a low ridge of whitish spines, running from back to front, and a much larger ridge curved in either side. Over the eyes, the selenite who untied me used his mouth to help his hands. They seemed to be releasing us that cavil. Remember, we are on the moon. Make no sudden movements. Are you going to try that geometry? If I get a chance. But of course they may make an advance. First, we remain passive, and the selenites, having finished their arrangements, stood back from us and seemed to be looking at us. I say seemed to be because, as their eyes were at the side and not in front, one had the same difficulty in determining the direction in which they were looking, as one has in the case of a hen or a fish. They conversed with one another in their ready tones. That seemed to me impossible to imitate or define. The door behind us opened wider, and glancing over my shoulder, I saw a vague large space beyond, in which quite a little crowd of selenites was standing. They seemed a curiously miscellaneous rabble. Do they want us to imitate those sounds? I asked Cavil. I don't think so, he said. It seems to me they are trying to make us understand something. I can't make anything of their gestures. Do you notice this one who is worrying with his head, like a man with an uncomfortable collar? Let us shake our heads at him. We did that, and finding it ineffectual, attempted an imitation of the selenites' movements. That seemed to interest them, but at any rate they all set up the same movement. But does that seem to lead to nothing? We desisted at last, and so did they, and fell into a piping argument among themselves. Then one of them, shorter and very much thicker than the others, and with a particularly wide mouth, squatted down suddenly beside Cavil, and put his hands and feet in the same posture, as Cavil's were bound, and then by a dexterous movement stood up. Cavil, I shouted, they want us to get up. He stared open-mouthed. That's it, he said, and with much heaving and grunting. Because our hands were tied together, we contrived to struggle to our feet. The selenites made way for our elephantine heavings, and seemed to twitter more volubly. As soon as we were on our feet, the thick-set selenite came, and patted each of our faces with his tentacles, and walked towards the open doorway that also was plain enough. And we followed him. We saw that four of the selenites, standing in the doorway, were much taller than the others and clothed in the same manners, those we had seen in the crater, namely with spiked, round helmets and cylindrical body cases, and that each of the four carried a goat with spike and guard, made of that same dull-looking metal as the bulls. These four closed about us, one on either side of each of us, as we emerged from our chamber into the cavern from which the light had come. We did not get our impression of that cavern. All at once our attention was taken up by the movements and attitudes of the selenites immediately about us, and by the necessity of controlling our motion, lest we should startle and alarm them and ourselves by some excessive stride. In front of us was the short, thick-set being who had solved the problem of asking us to get up, moving with gestures that seemed, almost all of them, intelligible to us, inviting us to follow him. His spout-like face turned from one of us to the other, with a quickness that was clearly interrogative. For a time, I say, we were taken up with these things, but at last the great place that formed a background to our movements asserted itself. It became apparent that the source of much, at least of the tumult of sounds, which had filled our ears, ever since we had recovered from the stupid faction. Of the fungus was a vast mass of machinery in active movement, whose flying and whirling parts were visibly indistinct, over the heads and between the bodies of the Selenites, who walked about us, and not only did the web of sounds that fill the air proceed from this mechanism, but also the peculiar blue light that irradiated the whole place. We are taking it as a natural thing that a subterranean cavern should be artificially lit, and even now, though the fact was painting to my eyes, I did not really grasp its import until presently the darkness came. The meaning and structure of this huge apparatus we saw, I cannot explain because neither of us learned what it was for or how it worked, one after another. Big shafts of metal flung out and up from its center, their heads traveling in what seemed to me to be a parabolic path. Each dropped a sort of dangling arm as it rose towards the apex of its flight and plunged down into the vertical cylinder, forcing this down before it. About it moved the shapes of tenders, little figures that seemed vaguely different from the beings about us. As each of the three dangling arms of the machine plunged down, there was a clank and then a roaring. And out of the top of the vertical cylinder came pouring this incandescent substance that lit the place and ran over as milk runs over a boiling pot and dripped luminously into a tank of light below. It was a cold blue light, a sort of phosphorescent glow, but infinitely brighter, and from the tanks into which it fell, it ran in conduits athwart the cavern. Thud, 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 thud came the sweeping arms of this unintelligible apparatus, and the light substance hissed and poured. At first, the thing seemed only reasonably large and near to us, and then I saw how exceedingly little the Selenites upon it seemed, and I realized the full immensity of cavern and machine. I looked from this tremendous affair to the faces of the Selenites with a new respect. I stopped, and Cavil stopped and stared at this thunderous engine. "But this is stupendous," I said. What can it be? For Cavil's blue lit face was full of an intelligent respect. "I can't dream. Surely these beings, men, could not make a thing like that. Look at those arms. Are they on connecting rods?" The thick-set Selenite had gone some paces unheeded. He came back and stood between us and the great machine. I avoided seeing him because I guess somehow that his idea was to beckon us onward. He walked away in the direction he wished us to go, and turned and came back and flicked our faces to attract our attention. Cavil and I looked at one another. "Cannot we show him we are interested in the machine?" I said. "Yes," said Cavil, "we'll try that." He turned to our guide and smiled, and pointed to the machine, and pointed again, and then to his head, and then to the machine. By some defect of reasoning, he seemed to imagine that broken English might help. These gestures, "Me look him," he said. "Me think him very much." Yes, his behavior seemed to check the Cellulite in their desire for our progress. For a moment they faced one another, their queer heads moved. The twittering voices came quick and liquid. Then one of them, a lean, tall creature with a sort of mantle, added to the putty in which the others were dressed, twisted his elephant trunk of a hand about Cavil's waist, and pulled him gently to follow our guide, who again went on ahead. Cavil resisted. "We may just as well begin explaining ourselves now. They may think we are new animals, a new sort of moon calf perhaps. It is most important that we should show an intelligent interest from the outset." He began to shake his head violently. "No, no," he said. "Me not come on 1 minute. Me look at him. Isn't there some geometrical point you might bring in apropos of that affair?" I suggested as the Selenites conferred again. "Possibly a parabolic," he began. He yelled loudly and leaped 6 feet or more. One of the four-armed moon men had pricked him with a gold. I turned on the gold bearer behind me with a swift, threatening gesture, and he started back, this in Cavil's sudden shout and leap. clearly astonished all the Selenites. They receded hastily facing us. For one of those moments that seemed to last forever. We stood in angry protest, with a scattered semicircle of these inhuman beings about us. "He pricked me," said Cavil, with a catching of the voice. I saw him, I answered. "Confounded," I said to the Selenite. "We're not going to stand that. What on earth do you take us for?" I glanced quickly right and left, far away across the blue wilderness of cavern. I saw a number of other Selenites running towards us. Broad and slender they were, and one with a larger head than the others. The caverns spread wide and low, and receded in every direction into darkness. Its roof, I remember, seemed to bulge down as if, with the weight of the vast thickness of rocks that prisoned us, there was no way out of it, no way out of it above. Below in every direction was the unknown, and these inhuman creatures with gods and gestures, confronting us and we two unsupported men. Chapter 15: The Giddy Bridge. Just for a moment that hostile pause endured. I suppose that both we and the Selenites did some very rapid thinking. My clearest impression was that there was nothing to put my back against, and that we were bound to be surrounded and killed. The overwhelming folly of our presence. There loomed over me in black, enormous reproach. Why had I ever launched myself on this mad, inhuman expedition? Cavil came to my side and laid his hand on my arm. His pale and terrified face was ghastly. "In the blue light, we can't do anything," he said. "It's a mistake they don't understand. We must go as they want us to go." I looked down at him and then at the fresh Selenites, who were coming to help their fellows. "If I had my hands free, it's no use," he panted. "No, we'll go." And he turned about and led the way. In the direction that had been indicated for us. I followed, trying to look as subdued as possible, and feeling at the chains about my wrists. My blood was boiling. I noted nothing more of that cavern, though it seemed to take a long time before we had marched across it. Or if I noted anything, I forgot it as I saw it. My thoughts were concentrated, I think, upon my chains and the Selenites, and particularly upon the helmeted ones with the goats. At first they marched parallel with us, and at a respectful distance. But presently they were overtaken by 3 others, and then they drew nearer, until they were within arm's length again. I winced like a beaten horse as they came near to us. The shorter, thicker Selenite marched at first on our right flank, but presently came in front of us again. How well the picture of that grouping has bitten into my brain. The back of Cavil's downcast head just in front of me, and the dejected droop of his shoulders, and our guide's gaping visage, perpetually jerking about him, and the gold bearers on either side, watchful yet open-mouthed, a blue monochrome. And after all, I do remember one other thing, besides the purely personal affair, which is that a sort of gutter came presently across the floor of the cabin, and then ran along by the side of the path of rock. We followed, and it was full of that same bright blue, luminous stuff that flowed out of the great machine. I walked close beside it, and I can testify it radiated not a particle of heat. It was brightly shining, and yet it was neither warmer nor colder than anything else in the cabin. Clang, 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 we passed right under the thumping levers of another vast machine, and so came at last to a wide tunnel in which we could even hear the pad of our shoeless feet, and which, save for the trickling thread of blue to the right of us, was quite unlit. The shadows made a gigantic travesties of our shapes, and those of the Selenites, on the irregular wall and roof of the tunnel. Ever and again crystals in the walls of the tunnel scintillated like gems. Ever and again the tunnel expanded into a stalactitic cavern, who gave off branches that vanished into darkness. We seemed to be marching down that tunnel for a long time. Trickle, trickle went the flowing light very softly, and our footfalls and their echoes made an irregular paddle, paddle, my mind settled down to the question of my chains. If I were to slip off one turn and then to twist it. So if I try to do it very gradually, would they see? I was slipping my wrist out of the looser turn. If they did, what would they do? Badfoot, said Kavil. It goes down, it keeps on going down. His remark roused me from my sullen preoccupation. If they wanted to kill us, he said, dropping back to come level with me. There's no reason why they should not have done it. No, I admit it. That's true. They don't understand us, he said. They think we are merely strange animals, some wild sort of moon cough birth. Perhaps it would be only when they have observed us better that they will begin to think we have minds when you trace those geometrical problems. Said I, it may be that we tramped on for a space. You see, said Kavil, these may be selenite of a lower class. The infernal fools, said I viciously, glancing at their exasperating faces. If we endure what they do to us, we've got to endure it, said I. There may be others less stupid. This is the mere out of fringe of their world. It must go down and down cavern passage tunnel, down at last to the sea hundreds of miles below. His words made me think of the mile or so of rock and tunnel that might be over our heads already. It was like a weight dropping on my shoulders, away from the sun and air. I said, even a mine half a mile deepest stuffy. This is not anyhow, it's probable ventilation. The air would blow from the dark side of the moon to the sunlit. And all the yung ki carbon dioxide trong kang ki would well out there and feed those plants up this tunnel. For example, there is quite a breeze. And what a world it must be, the earnest we have. In that shaft, and those machines, and the goat. I said, don't forget the goat. He walked a little in front of me for a time, even that goat. He said, well, I was angry at the time, but it was perhaps necessary. We should get on. They have different skins and probably different nerves. They may not understand our objection. Just as a being from Mars might not like our earthly habit of nudging. They better be careful how they nudge me, and about that geometry. After all, their way is a way of understanding too. They begin with the elements of life and not of thought. Food, compulsion, pain, they strike at fundamentals. Well, there's no doubt about that, I said. He went on to talk of the enormous and wonderful world into which we were being taken. I realized slowly from his tone that even now, he was not absolutely in despair at the prospect of going ever deeper into this inhuman planet burrow. His mind ran on machines and invention, to the exclusion of 1,000 dark things that beset me. It wasn't that he intended to make any use of these things, he simply wanted to know them. After all, he said, this is a tremendous occasion. It is the meeting of two worlds. What are we going to see? Think of what is below us here. We shan't see much of the light, isn't better, I remarked. This is only the outer crust down below on this scale. They would be everything. Do you notice how different they seem one from another? The story we shall take back. Some rare sort of animal, I said, might comfort himself in that way. While they were bringing him to the zoo, it doesn't follow that we are going to be shown all these things when they find we have reasonable minds. Said Kavil, they will want to learn about the earth, even if they have no generous emotions. They will teach in order to learn, and the things they must know. The unanticipated things he went on to speculate on. The possibility of their knowing things he had never hoped to learn on earth. Speculating in that way, with a raw wound from that gold already in his skin. Much that he said I forget, for my attention was drawn to the fact that the tunnel, along which we had been marching, was opening out wider and wider. We seemed from the feeling of the air to be going out into a huge space. But how big this space might really be, we could not tell because it was unlit. How little stream of light ran in a dwindling thread and vanished far ahead Presently the rock walls had vanished altogether. On either hand there was nothing to be seen, but the path in front of us and the trickling, hurrying rivulet of blue phosphorescence, the figures of Cavil and the guiding selenite, marched before me, the sides of their legs and heads, that were towards the rivulet, were clear and bright blue, the darkened sides, now that the reflection of the tunnel wall no longer lit them, merged indistinguishably in the darkness beyond, and soon I perceived that we were approaching a declivity of some sort, because the little blue stream dipped suddenly out of sight. In another moment, as it seemed we had reached the edge, the shining stream gave one meander of hesitation and then rushed over. It fell to a depth at which the sound of its descent was absolutely lost to us. Far below was a bluish glow, a sort of blue mist at an infinite distance below, and the darkness the stream dropped out of became utterly void and black, save that a thing like a plank projected from the edge of the cliff and stretched out and faded and vanished altogether. There was a warm air blowing up out of the gulf. For a moment, I and Cavil stood as near the edge as we did, peering into a blue-tinged profundity, and then our guide was pulling at my arm. Then he left me and walked to the end of that plank and stepped upon it, looking back. Then when he perceived we watched him, he turned about and went along it, walking as surely as though he was on firm earth. For a moment his form was distinct, then he became a blue blur, and then vanished into the obscurity. I became aware of some vague shape looming darkly out of the black. There was a pause shortly. Said Cavil, one of the other selenites, walked a few paces out upon the plank and turned and looked back at us unconcernedly. The others stood ready to follow after us. Our guide's expectant figure reappeared. He was returning to see why we had not advanced. "What is that beyond there?" I asked. "I can't see." "We can't cross this at any price." Said I could not go 3 steps on it. Said Cavil, even with my hands free. We looked at each other's drawn faces in blank consternation. "They can't know what it is to be giddy," said Cavil. "It's quite impossible for us to walk that plank. I don't believe they see as we do. I've been watching them. I wonder if they know this is simply blackness for us. How can we make them understand? Anyhow, we must make them understand." I think we said these things with a vague half hope the selenites might somehow understand. I knew quite clearly that all that was needed was an explanation. Then, as I saw their faces, I realized that an explanation was impossible just here. It was that our resemblances were not going to bridge. Our differences, well, I wasn't going to walk the plank anyhow. I slipped my wrist very quickly out of the coil of chain that was loose, and then began to twist my wrist in opposite directions. I was standing nearest to the bridge, and as I did this, 2 of the selenites laid hold of me and pulled me gently towards it. I shook my head violently. "No go," I said. "No use, you don't understand." Another selenite added his compulsion. I was forced to step forward. "I've got an idea," said Cavil, but I knew his ideas. "Look here," I exclaimed to the selenite. "Steady on, it's all very well for you." I sprang round upon my heel. I burst out into curses. But one of the armed selenites had stabbed me behind with his gold. I wrenched my wrists free from the little tentacles that held them. I turned on the gold bearer and found you. I cried, "I warned you of that. What on earth do you think I'm made of? To stick that into me if you touch me again." By way of answer, he pricked me forthwith. I heard Cavil's voice in alarm and entreaty. Even then, I think he wanted to compromise with these creatures. I say, "Bedford." He cried, "I know, away." But the sting of that second stab seemed to set free some pent-up reserve of energy in my being. Instantly the link of the wrist chain snapped, and with it snapped all considerations that had held us unresisting in the hands of these moon creatures. For that second at least I was mad with fear and anger. I took no thought of consequences. I hit straight out of the face of the thing. With the goat, the chain was twisted round my fist. There came another of these beastly surprises, of which the moon world is full. My male's hand seemed to go clean through him. He smashed like some softest, sort of sweet with liquid in it. He broke right and he squelched and splashed. It was like hitting a damp toadstool. The flimsy body went spinning a dozen yards and fell with a flabby impact. I was astonished, I was incredulous, that any living thing could be so flimsy. For an instant, I could have believed the whole thing a dream. Then it had become real and imminent again. Neither Cavil nor the Selenites seemed to have done anything. From the time when I turned about to the time when the dead Selenite hit the ground, everyone stood back from us to everyone alert. That arrest seemed to last at least a second after the Selenite was down. Everyone must have been taking the thing in. I seemed to remember myself standing with my arm half retracted, trying also to take it in. What next clam at my brain? What next then? In a moment, everyone was moving. I perceived we must get our chains loose, and that before we could do this, these Selenites had to be beaten off. I faced towards the group of these 3 goat bearers. Instantly one threw his goat at me. It switched over my head, and I suppose went flying into the abyss behind. I leaped right at him with all my might. As the goat flew over me, he turned to run as I jumped, and I bore him to the ground, came down right upon him, and slipped upon his smashed body and fell. He seemed to wriggle under my foot. I came into a sitting position, and on every hand the blue backs of the Selenites were receding into the darkness. I bent a link by main force, and then twisted the chain that had hampered me about the ankles, and sprang to my feet with the chain in my hand. Another goat flung javelin-wise, whistled by me, and I made a rush towards the darkness, out of which calm. Then I turned back towards Cavil, who was still standing in the light of the rivulet, near the gulf, convulsively busy with his wrists, and at the same time jabbering nonsense about his idea. "Come on," I cried. "My hands," he answered. Then realizing that I did not run back to him, because my ill-calculated steps might carry me over the edge, he came shuffling towards me, with his hands held out before him. I gripped his chains at once and unfastened them. "Where are they?" he panted. "Run away, they'll come back. They're throwing things." "Which way shall we go?" "By the light to that tunnel." "Hey, yes, today," and his hands were free. I dropped on my knees and fell to work on his ankle bonds. Whack came something, I know not what, and splashed the livid streamlet into drops about us. Far away on our right a piping and whistling began. I whipped the chain off his feet and put it in his hand. "Hit with that," I said, and without waiting for an answer, set off in big bounds along the path by which we had come. I had a nasty sort of feeling that these things could jump out of the darkness onto my back. I heard the impact of his leaps come following after me. We ran in vast strides, but that running, you must understand, wasn't no different thing from any running on earth. On earth, one leaps and almost instantly hits the ground again. But on the moon, because of its weaker pull, one shot through the air for several seconds before one came to earth, in spite of our violent hurry. This gave an effect of long pauses, pauses in which one might have counted 7 or 8 step and one sort off. All sorts of questions run through my mind. Where are the Selenites? What will they do? Shall we ever get to that tunnel? His Cavil far behind, are they likely to cut him off? Then whack stride, and off again for another step. I saw a Selenite running in front of me, his legs going exactly as a man's would go on earth. Saw him glance over his shoulder, and heard him shriek as he ran aside. Out of my way into the darkness, he was, I think, our guide, but I'm not sure. Then in another vast stride, the walls of rock had come into view on either hand, and in 2 more strides I was in the tunnel. And tempering my pace to its low roof, I went onto a bend, then stopped and turned back, and plug, Caval came into view, splashing into the stream of blue light at every stride, and grew larger and blundered into me. We stood clutching each other, for a moment at least. We had shaken off our capitals and were alone. We were both very much out of breath. We spoke in panting, broken sentences. "You've spoiled it all," panted. "Cathal nonsense," I cried. "It was that or death. What are we to do? Hide? How can we? It's dark enough. But we're up one of these side caverns, and then think, right? Come on." We strode on and presently came to a radiating, dark cavern. Caval was in front. He hesitated and chose a black mouth that seemed to promise good hiding. He went towards it and turned. "It's dark," he said. "Your legs and feet were lightest. You're wet with that luminous stuff." But a tumult of sounds, and in particular, a sound like a clanging gong, advancing up the main tunnel, became audible. It was horribly suggestive of a tumultuous pursuit. We made a bolt for the unlit side cabin forthwith. As we ran along it, our way was lit by the irradiation of Caval's legs. "It's lucky," I panted, "they took off our boots, or we should fill this place with clatter." On we rushed, taking as small steps as we could, to avoid striking the roof of the cavern. After a time, we seemed to be gaining on the uproar. It became muffled, it dwindled, it died away. I stopped and looked back, and I heard the pad of Caval's feet receding. Then he stopped also. At foot he whispered, "There's a sort of light in front of us." I looked and at first could see nothing. Then I perceived his head and shoulders, dimly outlined against the fainted darkness. I saw also that this mitigation of the darkness was not blue, as all the other light within the moon had been, but a pallid gray, very vague faint white, the daylight color. Caval noted this difference as soon, or sooner than I did, and I think too that it filled him with much the same wild hope. "Patford," he whispered, and his voice trembled, "that light, it is possible." He did not dare to say the thing he hoped. Then came a pause. Suddenly I knew by the sound of his feet that he was striding towards that pallet. I followed him with a beating heart. Chapter 16, Points of View. The light grew stronger as we advanced. In a little time, it was nearly as strong as the phosphorescence on Caval's legs. How tunnel was expanding into a cavern, and this new light was at the farther end of it. I perceived something that set my hopes leaping and bounding. "Caval," I said, "it comes from above. I am certain it comes from above." He made no answer but hurried on. Indisputably it was a gray light, a silvery light. In another moment we were beneath it. It filtered down through a chink in the walls of the cabin, and as I stared up, drip came a drop of water upon my face. I started and stood aside. Drip fell another drop quite audibly on the rocky floor. "Caval," I said, "if one of us lifts the other, he can reach that crack." "I lift you," he said, and incontinently hoisted me as though I was a baby. I thrust an arm into the crack, and just that my fingertips found a little ledge by which I could hold. I could see the white light was very much brighter now. I pulled myself up by 2 fingers, with scarcely an effort, though on earth I weigh 12 stone, reached to a still higher corner of rock, and so got my feet on the narrow ledge. I stood up and searched up the rocks with my fingers. The cleft broadened out upwardly. "It's climbable," I said to Caval. "Can you jump up to my hand if I hold it down to you?" I wedged myself between the sides of the cleft, rested knee and foot on the ledge, and extended a hand. I could not see Caval, but I could hear the rustle of his movements as he crouched to spring. Then whack, and he was hanging to my arm, and no heavier than a kitten. I lugged him up until he had a hand on my ledge and could release me. "Confound it," I said, "anyone could be a mountaineer on the moon," and so set myself in earnest to the climbing for a few minutes. I clambered steadily, and then I looked up again. The cleft opened out steadily, and the light was brighter. Only it was not daylight after all. In another moment I could see what it was, and at the sight, I could have beaten my head against the rocks with disappointment, for I beheld simply an irregularly sloping open space, and all over its slanting floor stood a forest of little club-shaped fungi, each shining gloriously with that pinkish silvery light. For a moment I stared at this soft radiance, then sprang forward and upward among them. I plucked up a half a dozen and flung them against the rocks, and then sat down, laughing bitterly as Cavill's ready face came into view. Its phosphorescence again. I said no need to hurry. Sit down and make yourself at home. And as he splattered over our disappointment, I began to lob more of these growth into the cleft. I thought it was daylight. He said daylight cry die. Daybreak, sunset, clouds, and windy skies. Shall we ever see such things again? As I spoke, a little picture of our world seemed to rise before me, bright and little and clear, like the background of some old Italian picture. The sky that changes, and the sea that changes, and the hills and the green trees, and the towns and cities shining in the sun. Think of a wet roof of Sunset Caval. Think of the windows of a Westwood house. He made no answer. Here we are burrowing in this beastly world that isn't. A world with its inky ocean, hidden in some abominable blackness below and outside. That torrid day and that death stillness of night. And all these things that are chasing us now. Beastly men of leather, insect men that come out of a nightmare. After all, they are right. What business have we here? Smashing them and disturbing their world. For all we know, the whole planet is up and after us already, in a minute. We may hear them whimpering and their gongs going. What are we to do? Where are we to go? Here we are as comfortable as snakes from jam, rocks loose in a Surbiton villa. It was your fault, said Cavill. My fault, I shouted. Good Lord, I had an idea, curse your ideas. If we had refused to budge under those goats, yes, they would have carried us over that bridge. Yes, they must have carried us from outside. I'd rather be carried by a fly across the ceiling. Oh, good heavens, I resumed my destruction of the fungi. Then suddenly I saw something that struck me even then. Cavill, I said, these chains are of gold. He was thinking intently, with his hands gripping his cheeks. He turned his head slowly and stared at me. And when I had repeated my words, at the twisted chain about his right hand, so they are, he said, so they are. His face lost its transitory interest even as he looked. He hesitated for a moment, then went on with his interrupted meditation. I sat for a space, puzzling over the fact that I'd only just observed this, until I considered the blue light in which we had been, and which had taken all the color out of the metal, and from that discovery, I also started upon a train of thought that carried me wide and far. I forgot that I had just been asking about what business we had in the moon. Gold. It was Cavill who spoke first. It seems to me that there are two courses open to us. Well, either we can attempt to make our way and fight our way, if necessary out to the exterior again, and then hunt for our sphere until we find it. Or the cold of the night comes to kill us, or else. He paused. Yes, I said, though I knew what was coming. We might attempt once more to establish some sort of understanding with the minds of the people in the moon. So far as I'm concerned, it's the first. I don't, you see, said Cavill. I do not think we can judge the Selenites by what we have seen of them. The central world, this civilized world, will be far below, in the profound caverns about the sea. This region of the cross in which we are is an outlying district, a pastoral region. At any rate, that is my interpretation. These Selenites we have seen may only be the equivalent of cowboys and engine tenders, the use of golds. In all probability moon calf golds, the lack of imagination they show. in expecting us to be able to do just what they can do. The indisputable brutality all seem to point to something of that sort. But if we endured, neither of us could endure. A 6-inch plank across the bottomless pit for very long. Who said cavil? But then I won't, I said. He discovered a new line of possibilities. Well, suppose we got ourselves into some corner where we could defend ourselves against these hinds and laborers if, for example, we could hold out for a week or so. It is probable that the news of our appearance would filter down to the more intelligent and populous parts. If they exist, they must exist. Who once came those tremendous machines? That's possible. But it's the worst of the two chances. We might write up inscriptions on walls. How do we know? Their eyes would see the sort of marks we made if we cut them. That's possible, of course. I took up a new thread of thought. After all, I said, I suppose you don't think these Selenites so infinitely wiser than men, but they must know a lot more, or at least a lot of different things. Yes, but I hesitated. I think you quite admit, Cavil, that you're rather an exceptional man. Oh well, you are rather lonely man, have been, that is. You haven't married, never wanted to, but why? And you never grew richer than you happened to be. Never wanted that either. You've just rooted after knowledge. Well, a certain curiosity is natural. You think so, that's just it. You think every other mind wants to know. I remember once when I asked you why you conducted all these researches. You said you wanted your FRS and to have the stuff called coverite and things like that. She know perfectly well you didn't do it for that. But at the time my question took you by surprise, and you felt you ought to have something to look like a motive, really. You conducted researches because you had to. It's your twist. Perhaps it is. It isn't one man in a million has that twist. Most men want, well, various things, but very few want knowledge for its own sake. I know perfectly well now. These Selenites seem to be a driving, busy sort of being, but how do you know that? Even the most intelligent will take an interest in us, or our world. I don't believe they'll even know we have a world. They never come out at night. They'd freeze if they did. They probably never seen any heavenly body at all, except the blazing sun. How are they to know there is another world? What does it matter to them if they do? Well, even if they have had a glimpse of a few stars, or even of the Earth crescent, what of that? Why should people living inside a planet trouble to observe that sort of thing? Men wouldn't have done it, except for the seasons and sailing. Why should the moon people? Well, suppose there are a few philosophers like yourself. They are just the very Selenites who never heard of our existence. Suppose a Selenite had dropped on the earth when you were at Lim. You'd have been the last man in the world to hear. He had come, you never read a newspaper. You see the chances against you. Well, it's for these chances we're sitting here doing nothing, while precious time is flying. I tell you, we've got into a fix. We've come unarmed, we've lost our sphere. We've got no food, we've shown ourselves to the Selenite and made them think we're strange, strong, dangerous animals. And unless these Selenites are perfect fools, they'll set about now and hunt us till they find us. And when they find us, they'll try to take us if they can, and kill us if they can't. And that's the end of the matter. If they take us, they'll probably kill us through some misunderstanding. After we've done, for they may discuss us perhaps, but we shall get much fun out of that. Go on the other hand, here's gold knocking about like cast iron at home. If only we could get some of it back. If only we can find our sphere again before they do. And get back, then yes, we might put the thing on a sound of footing. Come back in a bigger sphere with guns. Good Lord, quite cavil, as though that was horrible. I shied another luminous fungus down the cleft. Look here, Cavil. I said I've half the voting power anyhow in this affair. And this is a case for a practical man. I'm a practical man and you are not. I'm not going to trust the Selenites and geometrical diagrams if I can help it. That's all. Get backdrop all this secrecy. Or most of it and come again, he reflected. When I came to the moon, he said, I ought to have come alone. The question before the meeting, I said, is how to get back to the sphere. For a time we nursed our knees in silence. Then he seemed to decide for my reasons. I think he said, one can get data, it is clear that, while the sun is on this side of the moon, the air will be blowing through this planet sponge. From the dark side hither, on this side at any rate, the air will be expanding and flowing out of the moon caverns into the craters very well. There's a draft here, so there is, and that means that this is not a dead end. Somewhere behind us this cleft goes on and up. The draft is blowing up, and that is the way we have to go. If we try to get up any sort of chimney or gully, we shall not only get out of these passages, where they are hunting for us, but suppose the gully is too narrow. We'll come down again, I said suddenly. What's that? We listened. At first it was an indistinct murmur, and then one picked out the clan of a gong. They must think we are moon calves today. To be frightened to that, they're coming along that passage. Said Cavil they must be, they'll not think of the cleft. They'll go past. I listened again for a space. This time I whispered, they're likely to have some sort of weapon. Then suddenly I sprang to my feet. Good heavens, Cavil, I cried, but they will. They'll see the fungi I have been pitching down. I didn't finish my sentence. I turned about and made a leap over the fungus tops towards the upper end of the cavity. I saw that the space turned upward and became a drafty cleft again. Ascending to impenetrable darkness, I was about to clamber up into this, and then with a happy inspiration, turned back. What are you doing? Asked Cavil. Go on, said I. And went back and got two of the shining fungi, and putting one into the breast pocket of my flannel jacket, so that it stuck out to light our climbing, went back with the other for Cavil. The noise of the Selenites was now so loud that it seemed they must be already beneath the cleft. But it might be they would have difficulty in clambering into it, or might hesitate to ascend it, against our possible resistance, at any rate. We had now the comforting knowledge of the enormous muscular superiority our birth in another planet gave us. In another minute I was clambering with gigantic vigor after Cavil's blue-lit heels. Chapter 17, The Fight in the Cave of the Moon Butchers. I do not know how far we clambered before we came to the grating. It may be we ascended only a few hundred feet, but at the time, it seemed to me we might have hauled and jammed and hopped and wedged ourselves through a mile or more of vertical ascent. Whenever I recall that time, there comes into my head the heavy clank of our golden chains that followed every movement. Very soon my knuckles and knees were raw, and I had a bruise on one cheek. After a time, the first violence of our efforts diminished, and our movements became more deliberate and less painful. The noise of the pursuing Selenites had died away. Ting the Monoi, it seemed, almost as though they had not traced us up the crack. After all, in spite of the telltale heap of broken fungi that must have blamed beneath it, at times, the cleft narrowed so much that we could squeeze up it. At others, it expanded into great cavities, studded with prickly crystals or thickly beset with dull, shining fungoid pimples. Sometimes it twisted spirally, and at other times slanted down nearly to the horizontal direction. Ever and again, there was the intermittent drip and trickle of water. By us once or twice, it seemed to us that small, living things had rustled out of our reach. But what they were we never saw. They may have been venomous beasts, for all I know, but they did us no harm, and we were now tuned to a pitch when a weird, creeping thing more or less mattered little, and at last, Far above came the familiar bluish light again, and then we saw that. It filtered through a grating that barred our way. We whispered as we pointed this out to one another, and became more and more cautious in our ascent. Presently, we were close under the grating, and by pressing my face against its bars, I could see a limited portion of the cabin beyond. It was clearly a large space, and let no doubt, by some rivulet of the same blue light that we had seen flow from the beating machinery. An intermittent trickle of water dropped ever and again between the bars near my face. My first endeavor was naturally to see what might be upon the floor of the cabin. But our grating lay in a depression whose rim hid all this from our eyes. Our foiled attention then fell back upon the suggestion of the various sounds we heard, and presently my eye caught a number of faint shadows that played across the dim roof far overhead. Indisputably there were several Selenites, perhaps a considerable number in this space, for we could hear the noises of their intercourse, and faint sounds that I identified as their footfalls. There was also a succession of regularly repeated sounds, chid chid, chid, which began and ceased, suggestive of a knife or spade, hacking at some soft substance. Then came a clank as if of chains, a whistle and a rumble, as of a truck running over a hollowed place. And then again that chid chid, chid resumed. The shadows told of shapes that moved quickly and rhythmically in agreement with that regular sound, and rested when it ceased. We put our heads close together and began to discuss these things in noiseless whispers. They are occupied, I said. They are occupied in some way. Yes, they're not seeking us or thinking of us. Perhaps they have not heard of us. Those others are hunting about below. Suddenly we appeared here. We looked at one another. There might be a chance to. Parley, said Cavil. No, I said. Not as we are. For a space we remained, each occupied by his own thoughts. Chit chit. Chit went the chipping, and the shadows moved to and fro. I looked at the grating. It's flimsy, I said. We might bend to of the bars and crawl through. We wasted a little time in vague discussion. Then I took one of the bars in both hands and got my feet up against the rock until they were almost on a level with my head, and so thrust against the bar. It bent so suddenly that I almost slipped. I climbed about and bent the adjacent bar in the opposite direction, and then took the luminous fungus from my pocket and dropped it down the fissure. Don't do anything hastily, whispered Cavil, as I twisted myself up through the opening. I had a glimpse of busy figures as I came through the grating, and immediately bent down, so that the rim of the depression in which the grating lay hid me from their eyes, and so lay flat, signaling a device to Cavil, as he also prepared to come through. Presently we were side by side in the depression, peering over the edge of the cavern and its occupants. It was a much larger cavern than we had supposed from our first glimpse of it, and we looked up from the lowest portion of its sloping floor. It widened out as it receded from us, and its roof came down and hid the remoter portion, Ting the Manoi, lying in a line along its length, vanishing at last far away. In that tremendous perspective were a number of huge shapes, huge pallet holes upon which the Selenites were busy. At first, they seemed big white cylinders of vague import. Then I noted the heads upon them lying towards us, eyeless and skinless, like the heads of sheep at the butcher's, and perceived they were the carcasses of moon calves, being cut up much as the crew of a whaler might cut up a moored whale. They were cutting off the flesh in strips, and on some of the father trunks, the white ribs were showing. It was the sound of their hatchets that made the chit. Chit chit, some way away, a thing like a trolley, cable drawn and loaded with chunks of lax meat, was running up the slope of the cabin floor. This enormous, long avenue of holes that were destined to be food gave us a sense of the vast populousness of the moon world. Second, only to the effect of our first glimpse down the shaft, it seemed to me at first that the Selenites must be standing on trestle, supported planks. And then I saw that the planks and supports and the hatchets were really of the same lead and hue as my fetters. It seemed before white light came to bear on them. Footnote: I do not remember seeing any wooden things on the moon. Doors, tables, everything corresponding to our terrestrial joinery was made of metal, and I believe for the most part of gold, which as a metal would of course naturally recommend itself of the things being equal. On account of the ease in working it, and its toughness and durability, a number of thick-looking crowbars lay about the floor, and it apparently assisted to turn the dead moon calf over on its side. They were perhaps 6 feet long with shaped handles. Very tempting-looking weapons. The whole place was lit by 3 transverse streams of the blue fluid. We lay for a long time, noting all these things in silence. Well said, Cavil. At last I crouched over and turned to him. I had come upon a brilliant idea. Unless they lowered those bottas by a crane, I said, we must be nearer the surface than I thought. Why the moon calf doesn't hop and it hasn't got wings? He peered over the edge of the hollow again. I wonder now, he began. After all, we have never gone far from the surface. I stopped him by a grip on his arm. I had heard a noise from the cleft below us. We twisted ourselves about and lay as still as death, with every sense alert. In a little while, I did not doubt, something was quietly ascending the cleft. Very slowly and quite noiselessly, I assured myself of a good grip on my chain, and waited for that something to appear. Just look at those chaps with the hatchets again. I said. You're all right, said Cavil. I took a sort of provisional aim at the gap in the grating. I could hear now quite distinctly the soft twittering of the ascending selenite, the dab of their hands against the rock, and the falling of dust from their grips as they clambered. Then I could see that there was something moving, dimly in the blackness below the grating, but what it might be I could not distinguish. The whole thing seemed to hang fire just for a moment. Then smash, I had sprung to my feet. Struck savagely at something that had flashed out at me. It was the keen point of a spear. I have thought since that its length and the narrowness of the cleft must have prevented its being sloped to reach me anyhow. It shot out from the grating like the tongue of a snake, and missed and flew back and flushed again. But the second time I snatched and caught it and wrenched it away, but not before another darted ineffectually at me. I shouted with triumph as I felt the hold of the satellite resist my pull for a moment and give, and then I was jabbing down through the bars, amidst squeals from the darkness, and Cavil had snapped off the other spear, and was leaping and flourishing it beside me, and making inefficient jabs. Clang clang came up through the grating, and then an axe hurtled through the air and whacked against the rocks beyond. To remind me of the flushes at the carcasses up the cavern, I turned, and they were all coming towards us in open order. Waving their axes, they were short, thick little beggars with long arms, strikingly different from the ones we had seen before. If they had not heard of us before, they must have realized the situation with incredible swiftness. I stared at them for a moment, spear in hand. "Guard that grating, Cavil," I cried. Howled to intimidate them and rushed to meet them. 2 of them missed with their hatchets, and the rest fled incontinently. Then the 2 also was sprinting away at the cabin, with hands clenched and heads down. I never saw men run like them. I knew this bee I had was no good for me. It was thin and flimsy, only effectual for a thrust, and to long for a quick recover. So I only chased the selenite as far as the first carcass, and stopped there and picked up one of the crowbars that were lying about. It felt comfortingly heavy, and equal to smashing any number of selenite. I threw away my spear and picked up a second crowbar for the other hand. I felt 5 times better than I had with the spear. I shook it threateningly at the Selenite, who had come to a halt in a little crowd, far away at the cavern, and then turned about to look at Cavil. He was leaping from side to side of the grating, making threatening jabs with his broken spear. That was all right. It would keep the Selenites down for a time. At any rate, I looked up the cabin again. What on earth were we going to do now? We were cornered in a sort of way already, but these butchers of the cavern had been surprised. They were probably scared, and they had no special weapons, only those little hatchets of theirs. And that way lay Escape, the sturdy little forms ever, so much shorter and thicker than the moon calf's herds, was scattered up the slope in a way that was eloquent of indecision. I had the moral advantage of a mad bull in the street, but for all that, there seemed a tremendous crowd of them. Very probably there was those Selenites down the cleft, at certainly some infernally long spears. It might be they had other surprises for us. But confound it, if we charged up the cave, we should let them up behind us. And if we didn't, those little brutes up the cave would probably get reinforced. Heaven alone knew what tremendous engines of warfare, guns, bombs, terrestrial torpedoes, this unknown world below our feet, this vast the world, of which we had only pricked the outer cuticle, might not presently send up to our destruction. It became clear the only thing to do was to charge. It became clearer as the legs of a number of fresh Selenites appeared, running down the cabin towards us. "Good foot," cried Cavil. And behold, he was halfway between me and the grating. "Go back," I cried. "What are you doing?" "They've got." It's like a gun, and struggling, integrating between those defensive spears, appeared the head and shoulders of a singularly lean and angular Selenite, bearing some complicated apparatus. I realized Cavil's utter incapacity for the fight we had in hand. For a moment I hesitated, then I rushed past him, whirling my crowbars and shouting to confound the aim of the Selenite. He was aiming in the queerest way, with the thing against his stomach. Chaz, the thing wasn't a gun, it went off like crossbow more, and dropped in the middle of a leap. I didn't fall down, I simply came down, a little shorter than I should have done if I hadn't been hit, and from the feel of my shoulder, the thing that might have tapped me, and glanced off. Then my left hand hit again the shaft, and I perceived there was a sort of spear sticking half through my shoulder. The moment after I got home, with the crowbar in my right hand, and hit the Selenite fair and square. He collapsed, he crushed and crumpled, his head smashed like an egg. I dropped a crowbar, pulled the spear out of my shoulder, and began to jab it down the grating into the darkness. At each jab came a shriek and twitter. Finally, I held the spear down upon them with all my strength, lapped up, picked up the crowbar again, and started for the multitude of the cavern. "Bedford!" cried Cavil, "Bedford!" as I flew past him. I seemed to remember his footsteps coming on behind me. Step leap, whack, step leap. Each leap seemed to last ages. With each the cave opened out, and the number of Selenites visible increased. At first they seemed all running about, like ants in a disturbed anthill. One or two waving hatches and coming to meet me, more running away. Some bolting sideways into the avenue of carcasses. Then presently others came in sight carrying spears. And then others I saw a most extraordinary thing, all hands and feet bolting for cover. The cavern grew darker farther up. Flick, something flew over my head. Flick, as I saw it in mid-stride, I saw a spear hit and quiver in one of the carcasses to my left. Then as I came down, one hit the ground before me, and I heard the remote chuzz with which their things were fired. Flick. Flick, for a moment it was a shower. They were volume. I stopped dead. I don't think I thought clearly. Then I seemed to remember a kind of stereotype phrase. Running through my mind, zone of fire, seek cover. I know I made a dash for the space between two of the carcasses and stood there panting and feeling very wicked. I looked around for Cavil, and for a moment, it seemed as if he had vanished from the world. Then he came out of the darkness between the row of the carcasses and the rocky wall of the cavern. I saw his little face, dark and blue and shining with perspiration and emotion. He was saying something, but what it was I did not heed. I had realized that we might work from Moon Calf to Moon Calf up the cave until we were near enough to charge home. It was charge or nothing, come on, I said, and lead the way, Bedford, he cried unavailingly. My mind was busy as we went up that narrow alley between the dead bodies and the wall of the cavern. The rocks curved about, they could not enfold us, though in that narrow space. We could not leap yet without earthborn strength. We were still able to go very much faster than the Selenites. I reckon we should presently come right among them. Once we were on them, they would be nearly as formidable as black beetles. Only there would first of all be a volley. I thought of a stratagem. I whipped off my flannel jacket as I ran. Bedford Pundit Cavil behind me. I glanced back. What said I? He was pointing upward over the carcasses. White light, he said. White light again. I looked, and it was even so a faint, white ghost of light in the remoter cavern roof. That seemed to give me double strength. Keep close, I said. A flat, long selenite dashed out of the darkness and squealed and fled. I halted and stopped Cavil with my hand. I hung my jacket over my crowbar, ducked around the next carcass. Dropped jacket and crowbar, showed myself, and darted back. Just flick, just one arrow came. We were close on the selenite, and they were standing in a crowd, broad, short and tall together, with a little battery of their shooting implements, pointing down the cave. 3 or 4 other arrows follow the first. Then their fire ceased. I stuck out my head and escaped by a hair's breadth. This time I drew a dozen shots or more, and heard the selenite shouting and twittering, as if with excitement as they shot. I picked up jacket and crowbar again. Now, said I, and thrust out the jacket. Chuzz, chuzz, in an instant. My jacket had grown a thick beard of arrows, and they were quivering all over the carcass behind us. Instantly I slipped the crowbar out of the jacket, dropped the jacket. For all I know to the contrary, it is lying up there in the moon now, and rushed out upon them. For a minute perhaps it was massacre. I was too fierce to discriminate, and the Selenites were probably too scared to fight. At any rate, they made no sort of fight against me. I saw scarlet, as the saying is. I remember I seemed to be wading among those leathery, thin things as a man wades through tall grass, mowing and hitting first right, then left smash. Little drops of moisture flew about. I tried on things that crushed and piped and went slippery. The crowd seemed to open and close and flow like water. They seemed to have no combined plan. Whatever there were, spears flew about me. I was grazed over the ear by one. I was stabbed once in the arm and once in the cheek. But I only found that out afterwards, when the blood had a time to run and cool and feel wet. Where Cavil did I do not know, for a space. It seemed that this fighting had lasted for an age, and must need to go on forever, and suddenly it was all over, and there was nothing to be seen but the backs of heads bobbing up and down as their owners ran in all directions. I seen Ting the Ma Noi unhurt. I ran forward some paces shouting, then turned about. I was amazed. I had come right through them in vast flying strides. They were all behind me and running hither and further to hide. I felt an enormous astonishment at the evaporation of the great fight into which I had held myself, and not a little excitation. It did not seem to me that I discovered the Selenites were unexpectedly flimsy, but that I was unexpectedly strong. I laughed stupidly. This fantastic moon. I glanced for a moment at the smashed and writhing bodies, that were scattered over the cabin floor with a vague idea of further violence. Then hurried on after Cavil, chapter 18, in the sunlight. Presently we saw that the cavern before us opened upon a hazy void. In another moment, we had emerged upon a sort of slanting gallery that projected into a vast, circular space, a huge cylindrical pit running vertically up and down. Round this pit, the slanting gallery ran without any power, pit or protection for a turn and a half, and then plunged high above into the rock again. Somehow it reminded me then of one of those spiral turns of the railway through the St. Qatar. It was all tremendously huge. I can scarcely hope to convey to you the titanic proportion of all that place, the titanic effect of it. Our eyes followed up the vast activity of the pit wall, and overhead and far above, we beheld a round opening, set with faint stars and half of the lip about it, well and why, blinding with the white light of the sun. At that we cried out simultaneously. "Come on," I said, leading the way. "But there," said Cavil, and very carefully stepped near the edge of the gallery. I followed his example and craned forward and looked down, but I was dazzled by that gleam of light above, and I could see only a bottomless darkness, with spectral patches of crimson and purple floating therein. Yet if I could not see, I could hear. Out of this darkness came a sound like the angry hum one can hear if one puts one's ear outside a hive of bees. A sound out of that enormous hollow, it may be for miles beneath our feet. For a moment I listened, then tightened my grip on my crowbar and lead the way up the gallery. "This must be the shaft we look down upon," said Cavil, "under that lid. And below there is where we saw the lights." "The lights," said he, "yes. The lights of the world that now we shall never see." "We'll come back," I said, for now we had escaped so much. I was rashly sanguine that we should recover this fear. His answer I did not catch. "Hey," I asked. "It doesn't matter," he answered. And we hurried on in silence. I suppose that slanting lateral way was 4 or 5 miles long, allowing for its curvature, and it ascended at a slope that would have made it almost impossibly steep on Earth, but which one showed up easily under lunar conditions. We saw only two Selenites during all that portion of our flight, and directly they became aware of us, they ran headlong. It was clear that the knowledge of our strength and violence had reached them. Our way to the exterior was unexpectedly plain. The spiral gallery straightened into a steeply ascendant tunnel, its floor bearing abundant traces of the moon calves, and so straight and short, in proportion to its vast arch, that no part of it was absolutely dark. Almost immediately began to lighten, and then far off and high up, and quite blindingly brilliant, appeared its opening on the exterior, a slope of alpine steepness, surmounted by a crest of bayonet shrub, tall and broken down now, and dry and dead in spiky silhouette against the sun. And it is strange that we men, to whom this very vegetation had seemed so weird and horrible a little time ago, should now behold it with the emotion a homecoming exile might feel at sight of his native land. We welcomed even the rareness of the air that made us pant as we ran, and which rendered speaking no longer the easy thing that it had been, but an effort to make oneself heard. Larger grew the sunlit circle above us, and larger and all the nearer. Tunnels sank into a rim of indistinguishable black. We saw the dead bayonet shrub, no longer with any touch of green in it, but brown and dry and thick, and the shadow of its upper branches high out of sight made a densely interlaced pattern upon the tumbled rocks, and at the immediate mouth of the tunnel was a wide, trampled space where the moon cards had come and gone. We came out upon this space at last, into a light and heat that hit and pressed upon us. We traversed the exposed area painfully, and climbed up a slope among the scrub stems, and sat down at last panting in a high place, beneath the shadow of a mass of twisted lava. Even in the shade, the rock felt hot. The air was intensely hot, and we were in great physical discomfort. But for all that, we were no longer in a nightmare. We seemed to have come to our own province again. Beneath the stars, all the fear and stress of our flight, through the dim passages and fissures below, had fallen from us. That last fight had filled us with an enormous confidence in ourselves. So far as the Selenites were concerned, we looked back almost incredulously at the black opening from which we had just emerged. Down there, it was in a blue glow that now in our memory seemed the next thing to absolute darkness. We had met with things like mad mockeries of men, helmet-headed creatures, and had walked in fear before them and had submitted to them until we could submit no longer. Behold, they had smashed like wax and scattered like chaff, and fled and vanished like the creatures of a dream. I rubbed my eyes, doubting whether we had not slept and dreamt. These things, by reason of the fungus we had eaten, suddenly discovered the blood upon my face, and then that my shirt was sticking painfully to my shoulder and arm. Found it, I said, gauging my injuries with an investigatory hand. And suddenly that distant tunnel moth became, as it were, a watching eye cavil. I said, "What are we going to do now? And what are we going to do?" He shook his head with his eyes fixed upon the tunnel. "How can one tell what they will do? It depends what they think of us. And I don't see how we can begin to guess that. And it depends upon what they have in reserve. It is, you say, cavil. We have touched the mirrors outside of this world. They may have all sorts of things inside there, even with those shooting things. They might make it bad for us, yet after all," I said, "even if we don't find this sphere at once, there's a chance for us. We might hold out even through the night. We might go down there again and make a fight for it." I stared about me with speculative eyes. The character of the scenery had altered altogether. By reason of the enormous growth and subsequent drying of the scrub, the crest on which we sat was high and commanded a wide prospect of the crater landscape, and we saw it now all sere and dry. In the late autumn of the lunar afternoon, rising one behind the other, were long slopes and fields of trampled brown, where the moon calves had pastured, and far away in the full blaze of the sun, a drove of them burst slumberously. Scattered shapes, each with a blot of shadow against it, like the sheep on the side of a down. But never a sign of a Selenite was to be seen, whether they had fled on our emergence from the interior passages, or whether they were accustomed to retire after driving out the moon calves. I cannot guess at the time. I believe the former was the case. If we were to set fire to all this stuff, I said, we might find the sphere among the ashes. Cavil did not seem to hear me. He was peering under his hand of the stars that still, in spite of the intense sunlight, were abundantly visible in the sky. "How long do you think we have been here?" he asked at last. "Been where on the moon?" 2 or 3 days, perhaps more. Nearly 10, do you know? The sun is past its zenith and sinking in the west. In 4 days' time or less, it will be night. But we've only eaten once, I know that, and... But there are the stars. But why should time seem different? Because we are on a smaller planet. I don't know, there it is. How does one tell time? Hunger, fatigue, all those things are different. Everything is different, everything. To me. It seems that since first we came out of the sphere, has been only a question of hours. Long hours, at most 10 days. I said, "Well, that leaves." I looked up at the sun for a moment, and then saw that it was halfway from the zenith to the western edge of things. "For days, Cavil. We mustn't sit here and dream. How do you think we may begin?" I stood up. "We must get a fixed point we can recognize. We must hoist a flag or a handkerchief or something, and quarter the ground and work around that." He stood up beside me. "Yes," he said. "There's nothing for it but to hunt the sphere. Nothing. We may find it. Certainly we may find it." And if not, we must keep on looking. He looked this way and that, glanced up at the sky and down at the tunnel, and astonished me by a sudden gesture of impatience. Oh, but we have done foolishly to have come to this pass. Think how it might have been. And the things we might have done, we might do something. Yet never the thing we might have done here. Below our feet is a world. Think of what that world must be. Think of that machine we saw, and the lid and the shaft. They were just remote outlying things, and those creatures we have seen and fought with, no more than ignorant peasants, dwellers in the outskirts, yokels and laborers half akin to brutes down below. Caverns beneath caverns, tunnels, structures, ways. It must open out and be greater and wider and more populous, as one descends assuredly right down at the last. The central sea that washes round the core of the moon. Think of its inky waters under the spare lights. If indeed their eyes need lights, think of the cascading tributaries, pouring down their channels to feed it. Think of the tides upon its surface, and the rush and swirl of its urban flow. Perhaps they have ships that go upon it. Perhaps down there are mighty cities and swarming ways, and wisdom and order passing the wit of man. And we may die here upon it, and never see the masters, who must be ruling over these things. We may freeze and die here, and the air will freeze and thaw upon us, and then they will come upon us. Come on our stiff and silent bodies, and find the sphere we cannot find. And they will understand at last, too late, all the thought and effort that ended here in vain, his voice for all that speech. Sounded like the voice of someone heard in a telephone, weak and far away at the darkness. I said, one might get over that. How, I don't know. How am I to know? One might carry a torch, one might have a lamp, the others might understand. He stood for a moment with his hands held down, and a ruthful face staring out over the waste that defied him. Then with a gesture of annunciation, he turned towards me with the proposal. For the systematic hunting of the sphere, we can return, I said. He looked about him. First of all, we shall have to get to Earth. We could bring back lamps to carry, and climbing irons and 100 necessary things. Yes, he said, we can take back an earnest of success in this gold. He looked at my golden crowbars and said, nothing for a space. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring across the crater. At last he sighed and spoke. It was I found the way here, but to find a way isn't always to be master of a way. If I take my secret back to Earth, what will happen? I do not see how I can keep my secret for a year, for even part of a year sooner or later. It must come out even if other men rediscover it. And then, governments and powers will struggle to get hither. They will fight against one another. And against these moon people, it will only spread warfare and multiply the occasions of war in a little while, in a very little while. If I tell my secret, this planet to its deepest galleries will be strewn with human dead. Other things are doubtful, but that is certain. It is not as though man had any use for the moon. What good would the moon be to men? Even of their own planet what have they made? But a battleground and theater of infinite folly, small as his world is and short as his time. He has still in his little life down there far more than he could do. No science has toiled too long, forging weapons for fools to use. It is time she held her hand. Let him find it out for himself again, in 1,000 years' time. There are methods of secrecy, I said. He looked up at me and smiled. After all, he said, why should one worry? There's little chance of our finding the sphere, and down below things are brewing. It's simply the human habit of hoping till we die that makes us think of return. Our troubles are only beginning. We have shown these moon folk violence. We have given them a taste of our quality, and our chances are about as good as a tiger's. That has got loose and killed a man in Hyde Park. the news of us must be running down. From gallery to gallery turn towards the central part, no sane beings will ever let us take that sphere back to Earth. After so much as they have seen of us, we aren't improving our chances. Should I by sitting here, we stood up side by side. After all, he said, we must separate. We must stick up a handkerchief on these tall spikes. Here and fasten it firmly, and from this as a center. We must work over the crater. You must go westward, moving out in semicircles to and fro, towards the setting sun. You must move first with your shadow on your right, until it is at right angles with the direction of your handkerchief, and then with your shadow on your left, and I will do the same to the east. We will look into every gully, examine every skerry of rocks. We will do all we can to find my sphere. If we see the Selenites, we will hide from them as well we can for drink. We must take snow, and if we feel the need of food, we must kill a moon calf if we can, and eat such flesh as it has roar, and so each will go his own way. And if one of us comes upon the sphere, he must come back to the white handkerchief, and stand by it and signal to the other, and if neither cavil glanced up at the sun, we go on seeking until the night and cold overtake us. Suppose the Selenites have found the sphere, and hidden it. He shrugged his shoulders. Or if presently they come hunting us, he made no answer. You had better take a club, I said. He shook his head and stared away from me, across the waist, but for a moment he did not start. He looked round at me shyly, hesitated, au revoir. He said, I felt an odd stab of emotion, a sense of how we had goaled each other, and particularly how I must have goaled him came to me. Confounded, thought I, we might have done better. I was on the point of asking him to shake hands, for that somehow was how I felt just then, when he put his feet together and leapt away from me. Towards the north, he seemed to drift through the air. As a dead leaf would go, fell lightly and leapt again. I stood for a moment watching him, then faced westward reluctantly, pulled myself together, and with something of the feeling of a man who leaps into icy water, selected a leaping point and plunged forward to explore my solitary half of the moon world. I dropped rather clumsily among rocks, stood up and looked about me, clambered onto a rocky slab and leapt again. When presently I looked for Cavil, he was hidden from my eyes, but the handkerchief showed out bravely on his headland. White in the blaze of the sun, I determined not to lose sight of that handkerchief, whatever might betide. Chapter 19. Mr. Bedford alone, in a little while. It seemed to me as though I'd always been alone, on the moon. I hunted for a time with a certain intentness, but the heat was still very great, and the thinness of the air felt like a hoop about one's chest. I came presently into a hollow basin, bristling with tall brown, dry fronds about his edge, and I sat down under these to rest and cool. I intended to rest for only a little while. I put down my clubs beside me and sat, resting my chin on my hands. I saw with the sort of colorless interest that the rocks of the basin were here and there, in the crackling dry, lichens had shrunk away, to show them were all veined and splattered with gold, that here and there, bosses of rounded and wrinkled gold projected from among the litter. What did that matter now? My sort of longa had possession of my limbs and mind. I did not believe for a moment that we should ever find the sphere in that vast, desiccated wilderness. I seemed to lack a motive for effort. Until the Selenite should come, then I suppose I should exert myself, obeying that unreasonable imperative that urges a man, before all things, to preserve and defend his life, albeit he may preserve it, only to die more painfully in a little while. Why had we come to the moon? The thing presented itself to me as a perplexing problem. What is this spirit in man that urges him forever to depart from happiness and security, to toil, to place himself in danger, to risk even a reasonable certainty of death. It dawned upon me up there in the moon, as a thing I ought always to have known. That man is not made simply to go out about, being safe and comfortable and well-fed and amused. Almost any man, if you put the thing to him not in words, but in the shape of opportunities, will show that he knows as much against his interest, against his happiness. He is constantly being driven to do unreasonable things. Some force not himself, impels him, and go he must. But why, sitting there in the midst of that useless moon gold, amidst the things of another world, I took count of all my life, assuming I was to die a castaway upon the moon. I failed ting the manoi to see what purpose I had served. I got no light on that point, but at any rate it was clearer to me than it had ever been in my life before, that I was not serving my own purpose, that all my life I had in truth never served the purposes of my private life. Whose purposes, what purposes was I serving? I ceased to speculate on why we had come to the moon, and took a wide sweep. Why had I come to the earth? Why had I a private life at all? I lost myself at last in bottomless speculations. My thoughts became vague and cloudy, no longer leading in definite directions. I have not felt heavy or weary. I cannot imagine one doing so upon the moon, but I suppose I was greatly fatigued. At any rate I slept. Slumbering there rested me greatly, I think, and the sun was setting, and the violence of the heat abating. Through all the time I slumbered, when at last I was riled from my slumbers by a remote climber. I felt active and capable again. I rubbed my eyes and stretched my arms. I rose to my feet. I was a little stiff, and at once prepared to resume my search. I shouldered my golden clubs, one on each shoulder, and went on out of the ravine of the gold-veined rocks. The sun was certainly lower, much lower than it had been. The air was very much cooler. I perceived I must have slept some time. It seemed to me that a faint touch of misty blueness hung about the western cliff. I leapt to a little boss of rock and surveyed the crater. I could see no signs of moon calves or selenite, nor could I see Caval, but I could see my handkerchief far off, spread out on its thicket of thorns. I looked back me, and then leaped forward to the next convenient viewpoint. I beat my round in a semicircle and back again. In a still remote to crescent, it was very fatiguing and hopeless. The air was really very much cooler, and it seemed to me that the shadow under the westward cliff was growing broad. Ever and again I stopped and recognized it, but there was no sign of Caval, no signs of selenites, and it seemed to me that the moon calves must have been driven into the interior again. I could see none of them. I became more and more desirous of seeing Caval. The wind outline of the sun had sunk now, until it was scarcely the distance of its diameter from the rim of the sky. I was oppressed by the idea that the selenites would presently close their lids and valves and shut us out. Under the inexorable onrush of the lunar night, it seemed to me high time that he abandoned his search, and that we took counsel together. I felt how urgent it was that we should decide soon upon our course. We had failed to find this sphere. We no longer had time to seek it, and once these valves were closed with us outside, we were lost men. The great night of space would descend upon us, that blackness of the void, which is the only absolute death. All my being shrank from that approach. We must get into the moon again, though we were slain in doing it. I was haunted by a vision of our freezing to death, of our hammering with our last strength on the valve of the great pit. I took no thought any more of this fear. I thought only of finding Caval again. I was half inclined to go back into the moon without him rather than seek him until it was too late. I was already halfway back towards our handkerchief, when suddenly I saw the sphere. I did not find it so much as it found me. It was lying much farther to the westward. Then I had gone, and the sloping rays of the sinking sun, reflected from its glass, had suddenly proclaimed its presence in a dazzling beam. For an instant I thought, this was some new device of the Selenites against us. And then I understood. I threw up my arms, shouted a ghostly shout, and set off in vast leaps towards it. I missed one of my leaps, and dropped into a deep ravine and twisted my ankle, and after that I stumbled. At almost every leap, I was in a state of hysterical agitation, trembling violently and quite breathless. Long before I got to it, 3 times at least, I had to stop with my hands resting on my side, and in spite of the thin dryness of the air, the perspiration was wet upon my face. I thought of nothing but the sphere until I reached it. I forgot even my trouble of Caval's whereabouts. My last leap flung me with my hands hard against its glass, then I lay against it, panting and trying vainly to shout "Cabo! Here's the sphere." When I had recovered a little, I peered through the thick glass, and the things inside seemed tumbled. I stooped to peer closer than I attempted to get in. I had to hoist it over a little. To get my head through the manhole, the screw stopper was inside, and I could see now that nothing had been touched, nothing had suffered. It lay there as we had left it when we had dropped out. Amidst the snow, for a time, I was wholly occupied in making and remaking this inventory. I found I was trembling violently. It was good to see that familiar dark interior again. I cannot tell you how good. Presently I crept inside and sat down among the things. I looked through the glass of the moon world and shivered. I placed my gold clubs upon the table and sought out and took a little food, not so much because I wanted it, but because it was there. Then it occurred to me that it was time to go out and signal for Cavil. But I did not go out and signal for Cavil. Forthwith something held me to the sphere. After all, everything was coming right. There would be still time for us to get more of the magic stone that gives one's mastery over men. Away there close handy was gold for the picking up, and the sphere would travel as well, half full of gold as though it were empty. We could go back now masters of ourselves and our world. And then I roused myself at last, and with an effort got myself out of the sphere. I shivered as I emerged, for the evening air was growing very cold. I stood in the hollow staring about me. I scrutinized the bush around me very carefully before I leapt to the rocky shelf hard by, and took once more what had been my first leap in the moon. But now I made it with no effort whatever. The growth and decay of the vegetation had gone on apace, and the whole aspect of the rocks had changed. But still it was possible to make out the slope in which the seeds had germinated, and the rocky mass from which we had taken our first view of the crater. But the spiky shrub on the slope stood brown and sere, now 30 feet high, and cast long shadows that stretched out of sight, and the little seeds that clustered in its upper branches were brown and ripe. Its work was done, and it was brittle, and ready to fall and crumple under the freezing air so soon as the nightfall came. And the huge cacti that had swollen as we watched them had long since burst and scattered their spores to the 4 quarters of the moon. Amazing little corner in the universe, the landing place of men. Someday, thought I, will have an inscription standing there, right in the midst of the hollow. It came to me, if only this teeming world within knew of the full import of the moment, how furious its tumult would become. But as yet, it could scarcely be dreaming of the significance of outcoming, for if it did, the crater would surely be an uproar of pursuit. Instead of us still as death, I looked about for some place for which I might signal Cavil, and saw that same patch of rock to which he had left. From my present standpoint, still bare and barren in the sun, for a moment, I hesitated at going so far from the sphere. Then with a pang of shame at that hesitation, I left. From this vantage point I surveyed the crater again. Far away at the top of the enormous shadow I cast was the little white handkerchief. Fluttering on the bush, it was very little and very far. And Cavil was not in sight. It seemed to me that by this time, "You ought to be looking for me." That was the agreement, but he was nowhere to be seen. I stood waiting and watching, hands shading my eyes, expecting every moment to distinguish him. Very probably, I stood there for quite a long time. I tried to shout and was reminded of the thinness of the air. I made an undecided step back towards the sphere, but a lurking dread of the Selenites made me hesitate. To signal my whereabouts, by hoisting one of our sleeping blankets onto the adjacent scrub, I searched the crater again. It has an effect of emptiness that killed me, and it was still. Any sound from the Selenite in the world beneath that died away, it was as still as death. Save for the faint stir of the shrub about me, in the little breeze that was rising, there was no sound nor shadow of a sound. And the breeze blew chill. I found Cavil. I took a deep breath. I put my hands to the sides of my mouth cover. I bawled, and the sound was like some mannequin shouting far away. I looked at the handkerchief. I looked behind me, at the broadening shadow of the westward cliff. I looked under my hand at the sun. It seemed to me that almost visibly, it was creeping down the sky. I felt I must act instantly if I was to save Cavil. I whipped off my vest and flung it as a mark on the sere bayonets of the shrubs behind me, and then set off in a straight line towards the handkerchief. Perhaps it was a couple of miles away. A matter of a few hundred leaps and strides. I have already told how one seemed to hang through those lunar leaps, in each suspense. I sought Cavil and marveled why he should be. Hidden in each leap, I could feel the sun setting behind me. Each time I touched the ground, I was tempted to go back, a lost leap, and I was in the depression below our handkerchief. Astride, and I stood on our former vantage point, within arm's reach of it. I stood up straight and scanned the world about me. Between its lengthening bars of shadow, far away down a long declivity, was the opening of the tunnel up which we had fled, and my shadow reached towards it, stretched towards it, and touched it like a finger of the night. Not a sign of Cavil, not a sound in all the stillness, only the stir and waving of the scrub, and of the shadows increased, and suddenly and violently. I shivered. I began, and realized once more the uselessness of the human voice in that thin air, silence, the silence of death. Then it was I caught something, a little thing, lying perhaps 50 yards away down the slope, amidst the litter of bent and broken branches. What was it I knew, and yet for some reason I would not know? I went nearer to it. It was the little cricket cap Cavil had worn. I did not touch it. I stood looking at it. I saw then that the scattered branches about it had been forcibly smashed and trampled. I hesitated, stepped forward, and picked it up. I stood with Cavil's cap in my hand, staring at the trampled reeds and thorns about me. On some of them were little smears of something dark, something that I dared do not touch, a dozen yards away perhaps. The rising breeze dragged something into view, something small and vividly white. It was a little piece of paper crumpled tightly, as though it had been clutched tightly. I picked it up, and on it was smears of red. I caught faint pencil marks. I smoothed it out and saw uneven and broken writing, ending at last in a crooked streak. Up on the paper, I set myself to decipher this. I have been injured about the knee. I think my kneecap is hurt, and I cannot run or crawl. It began pretty distinctly written, then less legibly. They have been chasing me for some time, and it is only a question of the word time. Seemed to have been written here and erased in favor of something illegible. Before they get me, they are beating all about me. Then the writing became convulsive. I can hear them, I guess the tracing meant. And then it was quite unreadable for a space. Then came a little string of words that were quite distinct. A different sort of selenite ting the ma noi, who appears to be directing the writing became a mere hasty confusion again. They have larger brain cases, much larger and slenderer bodies and very short legs. They make gentle noises and move with organized deliberation. And though I am wounded and helpless here, their appearance still gives me hope. That was like Caval. They have not shot at me or attempted injury. I intend. Then came the sudden streak of the pencil across the paper, and on the back and edges blood, and as I stood there stupid and perplexed, with this dumbfounding relic in my hand, something very soft and light and chill touched my hand for a moment, and ceased to be, and then a thing, a little white speck, drifted as water shadow. It was a tiny snowflake. The first snowflake, the herald of the night. I looked up with a start, and the sky had darkened almost to blackness, and was thick with a gathering multitude of coldly watchful stars. I looked eastward, and the light of that shriveled world was touched with somber bronze westward, and the sun, robbed now by a thickening white mist of half its heat and splendor, was touching the crater rim, was sinking out of sight, and all the shrubs and jagged and tumbled rocks stood out against it, in a bristling disorder of black shapes, into the great lake of darkness. Westward a vast wreath of mist was sinking. A cold wind set all the crater shivering. Suddenly, for a moment, I was in a puff of falling snow, and all the world about me gray and dim. And then it was I heard, not loud and penetrating as at first, but faint and dim like a dying voice, that tolling, that same tolling, that had welcomed the coming of the day. Boom, 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 it echoed about the crater. It seemed to throb with the throbbing of the greater stars. The blood-red crescent of the sun's disk sank as it tolled out boom. Boom, boom. What had happened to Cavill all through that tolling? I stood there stupidly, and at last the tolling ceased, and suddenly the open mouth of the tunnel down below there shut like an eye and vanished out of sight. Then indeed was I alone. Over me, around me, closing in on me, embracing me ever nearer, was the eternal, that which was before the beginning, and that which triumphs over the end, that enormous void, in which all light and life and being is, but the thin and vanishing splendor of a falling star, the cold, the stillness, the silence, the infinite and final night of space. The sense of solitude and desolation became the sense of an overwhelming presence that stooped towards me, that almost touched me. No, I cried. No, not yet. Not yet, wait. Wait, oh wait. My voice went up to a shriek. I flung the crumpled paper from me, scrambled back to the crest to take my bearings, and then with all the will that was in me, leapt out towards the mark I had left, dim and distant now in the very margin of the shadow. Leap, 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 and each leap was 7 ages before me. The pale, serpent-girdled section of the sun sank and sank, and the advancing shadow swept to seize the sphere. Before I could reach it, I was 2 miles away, 100 leaps or more, and the air about me was thinning out, as it thins under an air pump, and the cold was gripping at my joints. But had I died, I should have died leaping once and then again. My foot slipped on the gathering snow as I leapt and shortened my leap. Once I fell short into bushes that crashed and smashed, into dusty chips and nothingness. Once I stumbled, as I dropped and rolled head over heels into a gully and rose, bruised and bleeding and confused as to my direction. But such incidents were as nothing to the intervals, those awful pauses when one drifted through the air towards that pouring tide of night. My breathing made a piping noise, and it was as though knives were whirling in my lungs. My heart seemed to beat against the top of my brain. Shall I reach it, O heaven? Shall I reach it? My whole being became anguish. Lie down, screamed my pain and despair. Lie down. The nearer I struggled, the more awfully remote it seemed. I was numb, I stumbled. I bruised and cut myself and did not bleed. It was in sight. I fell on all fours and my lungs whooped. I crawled, the frost gathered on my lips. Icicles hung from my mustache. I was white with the freezing atmosphere. I was a dozen yards from it. My eyes had become dim. Lie down, screamed despair, lie down. I touched it and halted too late. Screamed despair, lie down. I fought stiffly with it. I was on the manhole lip. A stupid fight, half dead, being the snow was all about me. I pulled myself in there, lurked within a little warmer air. The snowflakes, the air flakes, dancing about me. As I tried with chilling hands to thrust the valve in, and spun it tight and hard, I sobbed. I chatted in my teeth. And then with fingers that quivered and felt brittle, I turned to the shutter studs as I fumbled with the switches. For I'd never controlled them before. I could see dimly through the steaming glass, the blazing red streamers of the sinking sun, dancing and flickering through the snowstorm, and the black forms of the scrub, thickening and bending and breaking beneath the accumulating snow. Thicker willed the snow, and thicker black against the light. What if even now the switches overcame me? Then something clicked under my hands, and in an instant, that last vision of the moon world was hidden from my eyes. I was in the silence and darkness of the interplanetary sphere. Chapter 20, Mr. Bedford in Infinite Space. It was almost as though I had been killed. Indeed, I could imagine a man suddenly and violently killed would feel very much as I did. One moment a passion of agonizing existence and fear. The next darkness and stillness, neither light nor life nor sun, moon nor stars, the blank infinite. Although the thing was done by my own act. Although I had already tasted this very effect. In Cavill's company, I felt astonished, dumbfounded and overwhelmed. I seemed to be borne upward into an enormous darkness. My fingers floated off the studs. I hung as if I were annihilated. And at last, very softly and gently, I came against the bale and the golden chain, and the crowbars that had drifted to the middle of the sphere. I do not know how long that drifting took. In the sphere, of course, even more than on the moon. One's earthly time sense was ineffectual at the touch of the bale. It was as if I had awakened from a dreamless sleep. I immediately perceived that, if I wanted to keep awake and alive, I must get a light or open a window so as to get a grip of something with my eyes. Besides, I was cold. I kicked off from the bale, therefore clawed onto the thin cords within the glass, crawled along until I got to the manhole rim, and so got my bearings for the light and blind studs. Took a shove off and flying once around the bale, and getting a scare from something big and flimsy that was drifting loose. I got my hand on the cord quite close to the studs, and reached them. I lit the little lamp first of all, to see what it was that I had collided with, and discovered that old copy of Lloyd's News had slipped its moorings and was adrift in the void. That brought me out of the infinite, to my own proper dimensions again. It made me laugh and pant for a time, and suggested the idea of a little oxygen from one of the cylinders. After that, I lit the heater until I felt warm, and then I took food. Then I set to work in a very jingly fashion on the coverite blinds to see if I could guess by any means how the sphere was traveling. The first blind I opened, I shut it once and hung for a time, flattened and blinded by the sunlight that had hit me. After thinking a little, I started upon the windows at right angles to this one and got the huge crescent moon and the little crescent earth behind it the second time. I was amazed to find how far I was from the moon. I had reckoned that not only should I have little or none of the kickoff at the Earth's atmosphere had given us at our start, but that the tangential fly-off of the moon spin would be at least 28 times less than the Earth's. I had expected to discover myself hanging over our crater and on the edge of the night, but all that was now only a part of the outline of the white crescent that filled the sky. And Cavil, he was already infinitesimal. I tried to imagine what could have happened to him, but at that time I could think of nothing but death. I seemed to see him bent and smashed at the foot of some interminably high cascade of blue, and all about him the stupid insects stared. Under the inspiring touch of the drifting newspaper, I became practical again for a while. It was quite clear to me that what I had to do was to get back to Earth, but as far as I could see, I was drifting away from it. Whatever happened to Cavil, even if he was still alive, which seemed to me incredible after that blood stain. Scrap, I was powerless to help him. There he was, living or dead behind the mantle of that rayless night, and there he must remain at least, until I could summon our fellow men to his assistance. Should I do that something of the sort I had in my mind, to come back to Earth if it were possible, and then as a mature consideration might determine either to show and explain this fear to a few discreet persons and act with them, or else to keep my secret, sell my gold, obtain weapons, provisions, and an assistant, and return with these advantages to deal on equal terms with the flimsy people of the moon. To rescue Cavil if that was still possible, and at any rate to procure a sufficient supply of gold, to place my subsequent proceedings on a firm basis. But that was hoping far. I had first to get back. I set myself to decide just exactly how the return to Earth could be contrived. As I struggled with that problem, I ceased to worry about what I should do. When I got there, at last my only care was to get back. I puzzled out at last that my best chance would be to drop back towards the moon as near as I did in order to gather velocity, then to shut my windows and fly behind it, and when I was past to open my Earth with windows, and so get off at a good pace homeward. But whether I should ever reach the Earth by that device, or whether I might not, simply find myself spinning about it, and some hyperbolic or parabolic curve or other, I could not tell. Later I had a happy inspiration by opening certain windows to the moon, which had appeared in the sky in front of the Earth. I turned my course aside so as to head off the Earth, which it had become evident to me I must pass behind. Without some such expedient, I did a very great deal of complicated thinking over these problems, for I am no mathematician, and in the end I am certain it was much more my good luck than my reasoning that enabled me to hit the Earth. Have I known then as I know now the mathematical chances there were against me, I doubt if I should have troubled even to touch the studs to make any attempt. And having puzzled out what I consider to be the thing to do, I opened all my moonwood windows and squatted down. The effort lifted me for a time, some feet or so into the air, and I hung there in the oddest way, and waited for the crescent to get bigger and bigger, until I felt I was near enough for safety. Then I would shut the windows, fly past the moon with the velocity I got from it, if I did not smash upon it, and so go on towards the Earth, and that is what I did. At last I felt my moon would start with sufficient. I shut out the sight of the moon from my eyes, and in a state of mind that was, I now recall, incredibly free from anxiety or any distressful quality, I sat down to begin a vigil in that little speck of matter in infinite space that would last until I should strike the Earth. The heater had made the sphere tolerably warm, the air had been refreshed by the oxygen, and except for that faint congestion of the head that was always with me while I was away from Earth, I felt entire physical comfort. I distinguished the light again. Lest it should fail me in the end, I was in darkness, save for the earth shine and the glitter of the stars. Below me, Everything was so absolutely silent and still that I might, indeed, have been the only being in the universe. And yet, strangely enough, I had no more feeling of loneliness or fear than if I had been lying in bed on Earth. Now this seems all the stranger to me, since, during my last hours in that creature of the moon, the sense of my utter loneliness had been an agony, incredible as it will seem. The interval of time that I spent in space has no sort of proportion to any other interval of time in my life. Sometimes it seemed as though I sat through immeasurable eternities, like some god upon a lotus leaf, and again as though there was a momentary pause as I leapt from moon to earth. In truth, it was altogether some weeks of earthly time. But I had done with care and anxiety, hunger or fear for that space I floated, thinking with a strange breath and freedom of all that we had undergone and of all my life and motives, and the secret issues of my being. I seemed to myself to have grown greater and greater, to have lost all sense of movement, to be floating amidst the stars, and always the sense of Earth's littleness, and the infinite littleness of my life upon it was implicit in my thoughts. I can't profess to explain the things that happened. In my mind, no doubt, they could all be traced directly or indirectly to the curious physical conditions into which I was living. I set them down here just for what they are worth, and without any comment. The most prominent quality of it was a pervading doubt of my own identity. I became, if I may so express it, dissociate from Bedford. I looked down on Bedford as a trivial, incidental thing with which I chanced to be connected. I saw Bedford in many relations as an ass or as a poor beast, where I had hitherto been inclined to regard him with a quiet pride as a very spirited or rather forcible person. I saw him not only as an ass, but as the son of many generations of asses. I reviewed his school days and his early manhood and his first encounter with love, very much as one might review the proceedings of an ant in the sand. Something of that period of lucidity, I regret, still hangs about me, and I doubt if I shall ever recover the full-bodied self-satisfaction of my early days. But at the time the thing was not in the least painful, because I had that extraordinary persuasion that, as a matter of fact, I was no more Bedford than I was anyone else, but only a mind floating in the still serenity of space. Why should I be disturbed about this, Bedford's shortcomings? I was not responsible for him or them. For a time I struggled against this really very grotesque delusion. I tried to summon the memory of vivid moments, of tender or intense emotions. To my assistance, I felt that, if I could recall one genuine twinge of feeling, the growing severance would be stopped, but I could not do it. I saw Bedford rushing down Chancery Lane, hat on the back of his head, coattails flying out, en route for his public examination. I saw him dodging and bumping against, and even saluting other similar little creatures. In that swarming gutter of people, I saw Bedford that same evening, in the sitting room of a certain lady, and his hat was on the table beside him, and it wanted brushing badly, and he was in tears. I saw him with that lady, in various attitudes and emotions. I never felt so detached before. I saw him hurrying off to Lim to write a play, and accosting Cavil and in his shirt sleeves, working at the Sphere and walking out to Canterbury. Because he was afraid to come me, I did not believe it. I still reasoned that all this was hallucination, due to my solitude, and the fact that I had lost all weight and sense of resistance. I endeavor to recover that sense by banging myself about the Sphere, by pinching my hands and clasping them together, among other things. I let the light capture that torn copy of Lloyd's and read those convincingly realistic advertisements about the cutaway bicycle and the gentleman of private means and the lady in distress who was selling those forks and spoons. There was no doubt they existed. surely enough, and said I, this is your world. And you are Bedford, and you are going back to live among things like that for all the rest of your life. But the doubts within me could still argue. It is not you that is reading, it is Bedford, but you are not Bedford. You know, that's just where the mistake comes in. Confound it, I cried. And if I am not Bedford, what am I? But in that direction no light was forthcoming. Though the strangest fancies came, drifting into my brain queer. Remote suspicions like shadows seen from away. Do you know, I had a sort of idea that really I was something quite outside, not only the world, but all worlds and out of space and time, and that this poor Bedford was just a people through which I looked at life. Bedford. However, I disavowed him. There I was most certainly bound up with him. And I knew that wherever or whatever I might be, I must need feel the stress of his desires and sympathize with all of his joys and sorrows until his life should end.